Hello and welcome to the EXP Required podcast, where we talk about Final Fantasy and other things. I am, as always, joined by Mol.
Hello, how's it going?
How have you been? You all right?
Yeah, not too bad actually. Don't know about you, but I've been busy playing video games the last couple of weeks. Elden Ring DLC came out.
Ooh.
I've been way stuck into that with my best friend, and the Final Fantasy 14 expansion Dawn Trail also released. So
Was that released? Oh, I didn't realise. Oh, yeah, people have been going crazy over that, and I think like I was messaging you before, I was like finally tempted to get into 14. I think I've mentioned before that like I'm quite an obsessive person. I get locked into things. So that's what's kept me away from online gaming. But I think, from what I've seen with 14, with its community driven stuff and people meeting up with the game, I know that happens with other online games, but I think it's more up my alley, that kind of stuff. And there's Triple Triad as well. I mean, that's cool.
Oh, Triple Triad's the thing that'll get you sucked in. There are NPCs that I'm still trying to win cards off of, and I've done so much raging. Honestly, even just in the last 2 weeks, give me your fucking cards. It's not that difficult. I'm winning these matches. Give me the fucking cards.
So basically, you're a bully that goes around stealing cards off people in this game. Is that you?
No, worse. I'm a bully that goes around and can't even steal the cards. They hold them above my head.
It does look good. I watched someone stream it on Twitch a few months back, and I thought, you know what? If there was ever an online game I was going to play, it'd probably be this. And there is so much, like I say, real world, and they have Final Fantasy 14 meetups and things and stuff like that. So
yeah,
I think
14's community has been, I mean, it doesn't win awards for nothing. There's definitely the bad eggs, as there are in any community, but honestly, for the most part, 14's community, not just the fan community, but the actual development community as well, it's a really nice thing that's been fostered between the development team and the fans. The gameplay is maybe not necessarily for everybody, but the story definitely stands the test of time itself, and it has its own rich history. I mean, 14 is probably something that I'll end up talking about at length at another time, so I'll save my proper shill for a later date. But yeah, it's
once I've played it, we can wax lyrical about that for flipping ages, I'm sure, because that'll happen.
See you in like 7 years.
Episode of I don't know if you ever watched The Big Bang Theory, but there's the first couple of series of The Big Bang Theory. Penny's their neighbor, and she's like a stereotypical not into games, and they all are. And like one day she just gets into like, I think it's World of Warcraft or something, and then never leaves the couch. And she's like, "Why are you playing this stupid game?" And then like they introduce her to it, and she's sat there, and you see her and like surrounded by like empty bags of Whatsits or whatever the American equivalent is and stuff like that, just eating them.
Yeah, been there, Penny.
Yeah, I'm sure we've all been there. Anyway, so yes, today we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy Tactics, and I think there's the link. The link is, I mean, I was doing some research for this game, and I noticed Triple Triad in 14. I'm sure there's like actually a Ramza card, and there's some like references to
there is
Final Fantasy Tactics, so which is really good to see, because I know Final Fantasy Tactics, I mean, I'm not as familiar with this game. I'm going to do our typical thing of saying I'm not familiar with it and then talk about it for hours, but like this is relatively new to me, and I didn't realize how, I don't know if beloved's the right word. I didn't realize how still in tune with the community is. I know that there's like, you can get the actual Final Fantasy cards. I've got some of the Final Fantasy characters on them from Final Fantasy Tactics. Yeah, no, I'm quite intrigued by how relevant it still is, should we say?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things. I hesitate to really use the words cult classic because it's Final Fantasy. It's pretty mainline, even if it is a side title. But it's definitely garnered its own side community, I suppose, which is so much more entrenched within Tactics than like a lot of other games. I don't know about you, but I'd consider Tactics fans to be a lot more
noble.
No, very, very locked in to the actual source material, as opposed to, it's all about Sephiroth and his big sword and rah, rah, rah. There's a lot of depth to Tactics, as I'm sure we're going to end up discussing. And it's the kind of thing that I feel like you could end up writing theses about, which I'm sure you could do with other games as well. But Tactics fans definitely have the handle on that one.
So I'm going to set you off by saying the I word, which is Ivalice. It's like your trigger word, is it? I don't know. Is that the right phrase?
In.
That's it. That's it. That's it. That's the word I use to get you to strike and talk about things for ages. Yeah. So we're going to talk about this a lot. I think we were both a bit apprehensive about this one, weren't we? Because it's so detailed, and we're going to be able to. But no, we're going to be talking about this a lot. I can feel it. So this game came out in June 1997 on the PS1 in Japan, and then January 1998 in North America. It didn't come to Europe until the War of the Lions expansion or remaster, or what do you want to call
remaster, I think is probably the right word.
Port, probably I think expanded port is probably the technical term, in October 2007. So over 10 years after it came out originally. That's when I first played it.
See, now that's very interesting to me that you mentioned that, actually, because I remember going into my local game store as a wee one back in school and seeing Final Fantasy Tactics as a PAL game on the shelves.
Did you really? Wow.
Yes. So I don't know if that was a case of my local game store was actually selling NA games that wouldn't have been able to play, but I definitely remember seeing it and being like, what the hell is that?
Maybe it wasn't a poster, because and that's
no,
not
it was
me.
Definitely the game.
Oh, okay. There were a few Square titles that were the marketing was done in the Europe and never came out. Parasite Eve's a famous one. I know that I remember reading in a magazine, official PlayStation magazine back in 98, 99, buying that and being like, oh, okay, this Parasite Eve looks quite interesting, and it never came out. So I was just
the curse
thinking,
of being an EU player.
Yeah, that's interesting. It'd be nice to know if there are some people that are in the PAL territory that may have played this beforehand. I know that it was before Royal Alliance came out. I remember it being quite a big thing on the internet because, of course, back in the early 2000s, I spent a lot of time looking at guides for 7, 8, and 9, and this game always came up. I remember back in the early days of eBay, when I used to go and buy the old games on PS1, you'd see the North American copy. Of course, for that at that time, it was very difficult for me to export it because I didn't have any money. But I remember it being kind of like this this thing that was clearly very popular in the States. I mean, I know looking at sales figures, it was more critically well received and sold less than the other mainline titles. But I don't know, it's just something about the presence this had in the mid 2000s.
It's definitely endured a lot more than. Honestly, I would go so far as to say, and I know we waxed lyrical about 4 in our last episode, but I would go so far as to say that its presence has actually endured a lot more solidly than even 4 has. And I don't say that lightly, because I know 4 is such an important game within the Final Fantasy ecosphere.
Yeah, it's the greater title, but I mean, like, using that term, greater, with influence and impact and everything linked in. But it's a really interesting one, because this is the first game that has, you'll know more about this than me, the Ivalice Alliance, I guess, is the equivalent of the Final Fantasy VII compilation.
Yes.
But I don't know whether that technically contains this game. I know that the Lore of the Lions version is the first game in the Ivalice Alliance, but it's technically part of the Ivalice world, isn't it? You know what I mean?
It's part of the Ivalice Alliance. I believe it's actually technically the first entry into the Ivalice Alliance. I think the game that you're probably thinking of as being uncertain as to whether or not it belongs in the Alliance is Vagrant Story, which some people consider to be and others don't, including Matsuno himself. He doesn't consider it to be part of the Alliance.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I think Ivalice Alliance was used as like a marketing tool to sort of rejig this. Like the actual logo of Ivalice Alliance, I don't think appeared in the original Final Fantasy Tactics, but I think, like, retrospectively, I think Ivalice is its own bubble within the Final Fantasy world. And I think we spoke about 12 in our second episode. I think when 12 came out is when the sort of worlds seemed to combine, and obviously Matsuno was part of that for some time. Obviously that's another topic to talk about, how much he was involved with 12. But yeah, it's directed by Yasumini Matsuno.
Yasumi Matsuno.
Yasumini Matsuno. Yeah, I'm getting better. And he worked on the Ogre Battle strategy games with the Quest. Those were interesting ones. I remember being familiar with Ogre Battle because they were quite rare PS1 titles. At one point, I was trying to stupidly get all the PS1 games that are really hard to get hold of, and then realized I was never going to be able to do it. I've got the Ghost in the Shell game on PS1, which is quite rare in Europe.
Oh my god!
That one. But obviously the titles of those are based off of Queen songs, which make me laugh. Ogre Battle's from Queen 2, which is the second Queen album, funny enough, where it was all about, the heavy metal and all that stuff. So it's
Tactics Ogre, and I was remade as Tactics Ogre Reborn recently, wasn't it? I've never actually played those. Tactics games, or rather tactical games, really aren't my forte whatsoever, and I'll expand on that shortly when we talk about our history with the games. But what little I do know of it has actually been from exposure from other Final Fantasy Tactics fans, and they've all unilaterally loved Tactics Ogre and Tactics Ogre Reborn. So I think I'm going to have to eventually check that one out. God knows where I'll get the time from, but one day.
Vandal Hearts is another one. I own Vandal Hearts, and that's actually another one that's a rare title on PS1.
You're just showing off now, aren't you?
Yeah, no, and I'm honestly there's people that have got far more rare games than me. Suikoden's the big one. Suikoden 1 and 2, but I don't have them.
I remember seeing Suikoden back in the day.
Yeah, wishing you bought it. Air Gaze as well, that other classic Square related game.
Air Gaze, yeah.
Air Gaze. I've got Air Gaze. I've got a North American copy of Air Gaze with a chip PlayStation, so I can play it. Ivalice, it's its own world, isn't it? That's what I find fascinating about it, because the thing about Final Fantasy that we've talked about before is that, and this is deliberate, each game has its own universe. Now they have a similar universe. They all have chocobos and Moogles and stuff like that. And there's probably an argument that they are all set in the same universe, i.e. different planets within the same physical universe potentially. That's never been, said it's not the case.
I mean, some games have actually set out to make that a reality in and of itself anyway. Whether or not you want to feed into that is its own thing. But no, you're completely right. Ivalice is definitely its own separate universe within a universe.
Definitely, and it's really interesting. I know we won't talk too much about the Final Fantasy Tactics spin-offs from Tactics, or the sequels, or whatever you want to call them, because I don't know much about them. But
thank God, because I don't know shit about them.
I believe Tactics Advance was the first Tactics game we got in Europe. I think it came out in like 2004. So we had it, weirdly, we had the advanced game before the main game. And it'd be interesting to know how much of an influence they had on whether them bringing it out in Europe. I'm not sure how that worked. But I remember that being a big deal, because of course the Game Boy Advance was a big deal for me as a kid. I remember watching it on Gamesville, the TV show back in the day, and seeing them like do like a little deep dive into the game. And I remember thinking that looks amazing for a Game Boy Advance game, because it still has, I mean, it's obviously not as graphically good as this game, but I mean, at the time, a 3D or isometric game on a handheld was just mind-blowing. So I'm not that familiar with tactical games. I know there's like Fire Emblem and stuff like that as well.
Fire Emblem's another one of those series that I've heard really good things about a couple of the titles of the games, but never really having a Nintendo system, I've never been able to get into them, which is a shame as a barrier. I'd like to one day, but I'm also terrified that I'll just suck ass. I'm pretty sure I've said this in our second episode, but as far as Final Fantasy 12 Revenant Wings, I got stuck on like the first or second battle. I'm so bad at tactical games.
Yeah, we'll get into that, being bad at them. But talking about Ivalice a little bit for time being, what I think is fascinating about this is that, like I say, it is its own universe. It all ties in, and there are direct links to stuff. I mean, I don't know that much about the timeline of Ivalice. I don't know what's set first, 12, Vagrant Story, and I think there might be completely different eras, I think, from what I understand.
So as far as I understand it, Final Fantasy 12 is actually set first chronologically. Yeah, you save the world in Final Fantasy 12, and then at some point, I don't think it's particularly too far in the future of that game. It's maybe only 50, 100 years or so, but there is supposed to be some kind of great cataclysm which pretty much decimates everything. I believe like 90% of all the races on Ivalice are just destroyed and things go to complete shit. And it's years, I think it might be centuries after the fact, that's when Tactics is set.
Right.
So when I went through this for the first time, which was only the year before last, so I'm a relative newcomer to Tactics as well, that was something that I thought really interesting, that they started with Tactics chronologically in our world, and then they went on to make a sequel which was set prior to Tactics, while keeping it similar but not the same. It's a very interesting move that they made, especially when there are dots that you can connect but aren't necessarily supposed to be connected.
I mean, with this as well, I mean, like sort of looking into influences, I mean, I don't know necessarily what influences on the world Matsuno's claimed. I'll talk a bit more in a minute about his influence on the story and stuff like that, but I'm going to mention it. It does feel very Game of Thrones, this. Now, I think it's probably, obviously, because at the time when this came out, the Song of Ice and Fire book had only been out 1 year, and I seriously doubt whether we might have read it. Matsuno might have read it, but I think this is more akin to the influences that the Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire series had, which was obviously European and specifically British medieval history. I got quite into history of the kings and queens of Britain in lockdown times, because I ended up going for walks, listening to podcasts. So I find it fascinating. And you can see some of the stuff in like the king dying, and there've been two heirs, and there's been a war between it. I mean, there's the War of the Lions, which you mentioned in here. Sounds very similar to the War of the Roses.
Yeah.
I believe there's clear connection to that kind of thing.
No, I don't think that's something that can be overlooked, actually.
No.
I don't have any sources or interviews as to what Matsuno's actual influences were, but I would be very surprised if that wasn't one of them.
Totally. What I've read, Matsuno wanted to make a morality tale adventure story, with the main theme basically being a class war. So a lot of that he got during development, apparently, because some people at Square felt like royalty, and he felt like it might be difficult for him to succeed without that status, which I think is really interesting. I don't know if you'd read up on that.
I haven't actually.
I've not seen any quotes or anything like that, but that's what I've seen written down somewhere. And what I found fascinating about this, and we're kind of jumping around a bit, which I expect we will with this one, is that Matsuno wanted to create a second scenario with Delita's perspective. Because effectively the main gist of this game is you've got Ramza, who is a
nobleman's son.
A nobleman's son, that's right. And Delita, who's a commoner. And they grow up together and go on a different path. Now that's very Count of Monte Cristo, Prince and the Pauper type stuff.
Yeah.
So influenced by medieval type fiction as well, which is quite interesting. Classic story. Interesting that he wanted to have, obviously the main game itself is set from Ramza's perspective. You play as Ramza and his cronies, and Delita pops up every now and then. and helps you out every now and then and doesn't help you out at other times. But originally, Matsuno wanted to do two sort of
The
scenarios
dual
from what I understand.
perspectives.
Which
Yeah,
I think
I do remember hearing that before. And that was something that was actually then later implemented a little bit more in War of the Lions. I don't know if they were original missing scenes or if they were completely new scenes that were written for the War of the Lions version, but you do get a couple of extra scenarios with Deleter.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And the thing I was going to mention, but Final Fantasy 9, right? An excuse to talk about Final Fantasy 9.
Here we go.
So Final Fantasy 9 obviously came out in 2001, so 4 years after this game came out. And it's notorious for being a game that looked back over the shoulder of the last however many years it was of Square. And then, there's the mainline entries were revisited in some ways in that game. I didn't realize how much tactics influenced 9, or it certainly feels like it did. But maybe it's because it's, again, one of those things where it takes some of the same influences, because Final Fantasy 9 was very, very European in its architecture and stuff like that. Specifically, they went to Europe a lot to visit some sort of olden Europe buildings. This game feels very European in the same sense as that the castles are very European, whereas 12 feels quite Eastern with some of its architecture and stuff like that.
You see, that's interesting, because I'd still class 12 as being quite Western rather than Eastern in its architecture and feeling. Not entirely, but I'd say the same thing about 9. It doesn't feel Western completely either.
No, I think I'm more talking about the castle design and all that sort of jazz.
Okay,
yeah.
right.
So when they obviously go off into the world, it becomes a lot more inclusive is the right word. It varied, but like the world, the Mist Continent was very Western. And again, this game to me feels very Western in terms, not in terms of its story or its approach, more its kind of architecture and stuff like that. So it could be because of that, but the class part of it as well, because that's something I don't think that was visited, because obviously there's the story in 9 around, Zidane being a thief and the star-crossed lovers element of it. I just think that could have been coincidental, could have been just the team moved around and that was what was on their mind at the time. I just think it was, considering the fact that 9 was supposed to be an homage to the rest of the series, it wouldn't surprise me if perhaps they looked at tactics and thought, let's bring that element in a little bit as well.
Probably a reason I haven't thought about that is I haven't played 9 since I've been played through tactics.
Yeah.
So if there are nods, then I've missed them and not known them preemptively.
It could be a complete coincidence, but I don't think so. I think there's an element of, like, at the very least, the team had played 9 had probably played tactics and thought, let's bring it in some way. So I guess before moving on to the story, which will kind of touch upon this point as well, it is very interesting that the main character is Ramza, and he is the nobleman, like you say. It's interesting that he's the protagonist of the story, because up until this point, the protagonists of the story have kind of been the outcast themselves. I mean, essentially, he's an outcast because he's a nobleman that stops being a nobleman or doesn't want to be a nobleman anymore. But there's a lot of, the warriors of light coming from nowhere and being nobodies and bigging it up. Whereas they kind of inverted that in this game, which I think is quite interesting. So
no, it's definitely an interesting subversion, actually, considering the character development that Ramza goes through, because boy howdy, this game has a lot of character development with most of its characters, and Ramza is no exception to that whatsoever. But yeah, he definitely starts in a much loftier place than most other protagonists do. I'd say probably the only one that he's really qualified to compare to at the beginning is Cecil, mostly just because they both have their noble upbringing and then their fall from grace and then they're clawing their way back up to that position of power.
There is an element of that. I mean, I think the difference there is that he gets forced away from his position, whereas the choice that Ramza makes here is to literally just go, what, he sees the real world and goes, this is terrible, I'm going to leave myself. I think that's probably the only real difference, I think.
And it most certainly is a choice. Oh, I cannot wait to start talking about the story beats with you, Jack. I'm very excited.
Okay, let's draw back a bit and look at the framing for this, because it's really interesting, this, because from doing the research, there's lots of Final Fantasy channels on YouTube, as you know. Tactics has not been that well served.
No.
There's people that have talked about the game quite a lot, but the story itself has not been deep dived into as much as I would have thought it would have been. But, considering the fact that something like Game of Thrones is really popular, considering the fact that we've got Final Fantasy 16, which feels similar to this, probably again, because of the fact that's clearly influenced by Game of Thrones, there's an element of that. I want to say more human story. I mean, there obviously are fantastical elements of this, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. But it certainly starts off as being more of a humans versus humans political.
Something that I noted on my my first take through of this, and this was from my final thoughts overview, and this isn't a spoiler whatsoever, but it was kind of like the first chapter, because there are 4 chapters in this game. They're all split up into segments. The first one of it doesn't deal with anything fantastical. It's not Final Fantasy. It's final War of the Lions. It's definitely a lot more human, and the human story spoke to me a lot more than the fantastical elements
Yeah,
later on did. I kind of came out at the other end thinking I really enjoyed what I ended up being given as far as the fantastical elements, but if it had stayed just as it had been shown to me in chapter 1 the entire way through, I would not have been disappointed
I agree.
whatsoever. And I don't think I could say that about a lot of Final Fantasy games, actually. I think if you took away the fantastical elements in a lot of games and kept it to just the human natures, they'd be engaging, and I'm sure they'd be ultimately different stories overall, but they wouldn't be as interesting to me. Tactics stands alone in that regard. Its characters are that compelling to me that I want to just know more about them. I want to know more about the people's
Yeah.
struggle, about the world around. Like, fuck off the church. Let me talk to the commoners. Come on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we're going to make the Game of Thrones comparison. I don't know how familiar you are with Game of Thrones as a series.
I've read the books, and I think
Right.
I watched
Okay.
about 4 seasons back when it was still airing.
Worth watch the ones worth watching then. So
Yeah.
let's not get into that. But the what I like about I'll specifically say Game of Thrones. I know people will flame me for not saying Song of Ice and Fire, but the series itself kind of throttles back on some of the ideas.
Mhm.
What I've always liked about that world, it is more political, and the fantastical elements tie in with the politics.
Mhm.
So the fact the dragons are medieval nukes.
Yeah.
There's less about, oh, and this person's got that magical power, and I'm more powerful than you. And then there's like this big battle, which would be more of a comic book thing, which is great, it has its place. But like the White Walkers, the zombies, which are kind of an allegory for a plague or a climate change, which I think is clearly it's very interlinked with the world politically, which I think is really interesting. In this, obviously, they are the church, and the demons and whatever is like an existential threat, which it kind of serves the same sort of purpose as that stuff. Is effectively Rams are going, look, this is more important to deal with than our quarrels, which is kind of the same thing. But yeah, no, I do agree with you that it could have stood on its own without all that stuff, which is really interesting. I think as well, before we deep into it, because I'm going to do a little bit of an intro on the story stuff, is that what I found interesting about this game is that both the game and the story could stand on their own. So when I first started playing it, I'll be honest with you, I got completely confused as to what was going on, which I think is a standard thing. It was very, very difficult to get into, which is what I won't hold it against it, because it's easy to understand what's going on with the characters, but knowing who's related to who and who's married to who and who's betrayed who.
Oh God, trying to put a family tree down for the royal family, which is entirely off screen. People have done that, and they've found missing links. It's a deep world to get into.
You kind of need a different. You need to sort of think about it after, which is good. It's good to be able to sort of think, use your imagination, think about it a bit more. But I will say that if you just wanted to ignore that story of it and just play the game, it's also really, really good. It's a really cool, interesting game. But we'll get to that. So the story, what I've got here is I've got the prologue, which is written down. I believe it came in the PS1 version, so I think they might have tweaked it for the War of the Lions version. So the kingdom of Ivalice, forever guarded by the twin-headed lions and by the sun that shines upon them. ... A year after the defeat of the 50 Years' War, the king has died from a terminal illness earlier, and the prince who succeeded him was only 2 years old. This meant his guardian would actually reign in his stead as king. The Queen's elder brother, Larg, was designated as a guardian, but fearing an oppressive reign from the Queen, the Parliament ousted the potential prince, appointing him instead of the King's cousin, Prince Goltana, as the guardian. Wow, good grammar. Prince Goltana and Prince Larg are both respected generals who proved themselves in the 50 Years' War. Prince Goltana had the support of the powerful nobles, but disenfranchised nobles and knights clearly supported Prince Larg. The black lion symbolizes Prince Goltana, and the white lion symbolizes Prince Larg. This is the beginning of what will later be known as the Lion War. So that sort of kicks off the story.
That is most certainly the PSX version, yes.
Yeah, some of your wording there's a little bit other places.
Oh, the grammar.
Yeah, the grammar was a little bit what's going on there. But yeah, effectively that sort of sets the scene. That we've effectively started in the middle of a conflict. And of course, the framing for the actual characters is that it kicks off with, is it Arazalam or Arazam, a historian?
So I will say before we get too deep into anything else, one of the big differences between versions. So for those who don't know, obviously this came out originally for the PlayStation 1 and then later on PSP as the remade War of the Lions version with a different translation. This wasn't just the translation of lines in the game, but also for some names. Not for everybody, but certainly for enough people that spellings of character names is one of those things that I've seen people arguing about on the internet.
Of course I do.
Is it Argath or is it Algus? Is it Olan or is it Oren? Is it Arazlam or is it Arzalam? The list goes on. Unfortunately, Tactics has one of those casts where a lot of the character names Bit of a mouthful,
Tidus.
to say the least. Oh, I'm thinking of names like
So no, just
Valmafra.
Tidus / Tidus. And no, there are lots of, at least they didn't like, well, they pretty might have told me they do with one of the random offshoot characters, but at least they didn't like completely just name them something completely different. At least it's like sort of close.
No, it's definitely close. It's just from looking at the katakana, it's just a different interpretation of how the word could be spelled, but it's definitely led to some arguments. So if at any point you wonder if you're saying the right name, just charge full steam ahead with the one that you've got. It'll be all right.
So anyway, Billy the historian. Arazalam, historian, reaching into the past. He's researching the past, reads about Delita, who has been heralded as the hero of that time. But actually, it turns out that Ramza, is it Beowulf? How do you pronounce his name?
I've always said it as Beowulf.
Beowulf, let's say that. Ramza Beowulf may have been the true hero, that the churches had him pinned as a heretic and covered it up. Now that, I thought, was absolutely brilliant, because that's, again, another situation in history. History is written by the victors. In real history, you've got like thing where like Richard III had like apparently had this hunch, but actually when they found his skeleton, actually quite recently, he only had like a slight bit of sciatica. It was very, very minor. But of course, on his painting, there was this rumor that his painting had been tweaked to make him look worse. It's the same sort of thing. I mean, I'm not comparing Ramses to Richard III, but necessarily with his actions or anything like that. But it's interesting how that, and again, it's something that happens in Song of Ice and Fire as well, is that people across the world have a different perspective on what's actually happened and what they've been told, which I think is really clever. Good storytelling. I think
especially considering the setup that we're given with the box as well, of like, this is the political situation. There is definitely something very big and far-reaching about to happen, or is in the middle of happening. And by the way, stuff has been covered up. Like, from the get-go that whatever you're about to be shown may or may not be true. And that's something that I think rings true all the way through Tactics. And I was reminded of, particularly in the epilogue, when the narrator Arislan actually does say again, like, it's been like, I think it's 500 years or so that he's found these papers after the fact. Like, this is all a secondhand account, which was all interviews in the first place. Like, whether or not you actually believe Tactics happened the way that it did or not is up for interpretation, and I adore that, because it's great. Not only these characters are really nuanced anyway, and you don't necessarily know what they're thinking or how their actions are from the get-go, but like, to know that even within the universe itself, you don't know whether or not this is still the truth, or whether this is just someone else's interpretation of what happened as a secondhand source anyway. Like, that's a fantastic route to go for as far as a narrative.
Yeah, no, that's a really good framing device, I guess you could say, as well.
So there was precisely one interview that I could find with the development team, or parts of the development team, as far as Final Fantasy Tactics goes. And as far as I'm aware, it's the only interview that was ever given. So this was, the interviewees were Sakaguchi, who was the producer, Matsuno, who was the director, and a man named Hiroyuki Ito, who was the battle designer.
Yep.
And within this interview, they actually say that originally the idea for Tactics was Sakaguchi's idea, not Matsuno's, which I did not realize. Apparently he'd been wanting to make something like this forever. He ended up giving Matsuno like a 5 or 6 page document with ideas, and pretty much just told him to pick and choose what he liked and to make something out of that. Meanwhile, Matsuno had also wanted to do something like this forever. So the two of them managed to like just meet at exactly the right points in their lives, essentially, and came out with this masterpiece. Something that I found really fantastic within the actual game itself, and like, even from a player perspective, from a battle perspective, the way that the maps themselves are all meant to be enjoyed as dioramas rather than just maps. Like, and I'm sure people have talked about this for years and years, but the sprite work in Tactics is insane. It's
brilliant.
So detailed for such tiny sprites, and it absolutely holds up. As much as I would love to see Tactics remade in a full 3D style and like get some real mocap acting in there and better voice acting, it would never be able to stand up to the way that the sprite work is. It's just so masterfully done, and the dioramas and maps aren't exempt from that whatsoever. The fact that you can spin them to see everything that's going on is like, that blew my mind.
That noise as well, that little sound effect when it moves is really cool. Yeah, that's interesting, because that sort of the way I describe this to people is it's Final Fantasy was clearly influenced by Dungeons and Dragons, right? Yeah. Whereas I always describe this sort of game as being more like Warhammer, where you sort of build, because I did at least do a little bit of Warhammer. I don't do it anymore, but like it was usually a lot about like building the world and creating structures and stuff like that, where people could stand and things like that. And of course, what's interesting about this, I'm just jumping into the game design bit a little bit more, is I believe I read somewhere that they wanted this game to run at 60 frames per second originally.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, they had to make the maps a little bit smaller. So I can't remember the grids, 16 by 16, something like that,
That's
maybe a
correct,
bit more.
yes.
But at no point playing this game did I feel like things were smaller.
Confined
because of how they built up, how they build down, how every single map. I mean, some of the random encounter maps that you have throughout the game are the same map. If you get to a location, it's the same map again, which is fine.
Yeah.
But every different castle, different area, the way that they built them is absolutely brilliant. I think it's fantastic.
They all feel so unique. They all feel so relevant to the parts of the story that they're in. Like,
totally.
And again, the fact that you can spin the maps around to see different things and hide behind different, like, that's a level of customization that I've never seen again in a Final Fantasy game. And they, I know we've talked about this before. They've all done something different as far as battles, as far as maps, as far as stories. Nothing has ever done what Tactics has done since.
No, it hasn't. And what was interesting, like, ironically, we kept this out of our golden era discussion. It really is interesting. I mean, I mentioned 9 there again, and I've got to mention 8 as well, and 7, because this has been developed the same time as 7. I think it was in development at the same time. I don't know which started first, but it's going to be a matter of weeks, months, whatever. Anyway, I don't think it was anything necessarily to talk about. But this came out just after 7 came out.
Right.
Like I mentioned before, it's quite hard to get into this game. There is a massive learning curve, certainly for the for the story and for also the
actual gameplay itself.
The game's system. It's quite tricky. I mean, there are some really good tutorials that come along with the game, but who watches them? Hey, what's interesting is that it felt very much like 8 in that sense. Because 8 has a massive learning curve. And then, I sort of started the game after playing it for a bit because I had no idea what I was doing. It doesn't hold your hand very much. Again, like 8 doesn't. So it's quite interesting how the design for that, the influence of that game. This game came out just before 8 did, kind of. But they have a similar sort of like, let's let things be as customizable as possible for the player. Which I think is really interesting. I mean, I think, dare I say it, this game does it better.
No, I think you're right on that one. 8 does actually have a fair amount of customization, but being able to build up not just, your entire party, but your entire party from scratch, and to be able to dismiss units at any point and bring in new units, and specifically fish for stat points to be able to build the best team. Like, it's been maxing at its most tedious, but it's definitely, you're right, it feels like there's a lot more customization.
Totally. And it's interesting because we're going to be jumping around quite a bit because of how well designed this game is, because there's little things about this game I really, really like that sort of build on the story and the world building. So, for example, everyone's got names. Literally, like, you go into the forest, you find some monsters and goblins, they've got names. That is incredible. Like, the fact that you've basically created this world where everyone and everything is important in that world. Yeah. Which it kind of ties in with the theme of the story. Is you've got this class war that's going on where effectively the nobility have stiffed and shafted the commoners that have helped them win the war. And that's effectively what's created the tension there. And of course, you've got 2 people that are one side's claiming, to help the commoners, and one side's, claiming to help the nobility. And that ties in, with the direct human interactions we've got. And obviously Ramza and Delita are best mates at the start anyway. And he's lived with, here we go, Tita, whatever her name is.
Depends on the translation,
Delita's sister. And of course, I mean, okay, at this point, there's going to be spoilers ahead for the rest of the story for this game. She gets killed in the first chapter, which obviously completely makes Delita go mad, but also changes Ram's perspective because he's grown up with this girl as well. It's effectively his like adopted sister in a sense. And he recognizes that the nobility aren't as good as they say they are. They're a bit more Machiavellian or treacherous and less honest. And he's been led to believe that nobles are about honesty and bringing things forward, and has had his mind shattered, and then decides he's going to become more of a sort of a rogue, which again, it's a story thread that they used in Final Fantasy 16.
So the thing about Ramza is that he's such an incredibly innocent protagonist. He's very naive in a lot of places in his life, but at no point is this necessarily a bad thing for his character. It's definitely a character flaw, but something that I noticed continually is that no matter how naive and trusting Ramza is, even in situations where he really, really shouldn't be, oh my God, I wanted to smack him a couple of times, he's still wants to see the best in people at all times, and at no point does he waver. Even when he's at his absolute lowest, he walks away from the nobility to try and do better than that. He becomes a mercenary to try and find a better path to forge in life. And this is not just on the heels of Teacher being murdered, which, there's also a lot more that goes into, it's not just Teacher being murdered, it's Teacher's been murdered, and also these children have been sent out to try and finish off what the nobles are trying to do by helping put down the peasant revolution, essentially. Meanwhile, your peasant-born best friend is learning that, oh, maybe his place in the world isn't actually here at his noble friend's side. Maybe this isn't the place he's meant to be. There's so many factors that, like, actually talking about tactics as just a very simple story is going to be a very, I would say, impossible thing to do, because there's just so many factors that all lead into one another. But despite it all, it remains relatively simple to follow because of Rams's innocence and naivety, because he only sees one goal and he's going to get to that goal no matter what. And it's not that he's not willing to listen to the other side or thinks that he's, his vision is the only one worth listening to or anything like that. It's just that he wants the best for everyone.
Yeah, totally.
It's not even like that's necessarily the first time we've ever seen a Final Fantasy protagonist do that. I mean, look at Cecil, for God's sakes. The man wants to see the best in everyone whatsoever. And again, Cecil and Ramza kind of have a common thread there, in that they really do want the best, but they're not against using force to try and get that, but not in a negative sense.
No, I mean, it's interesting that, again, it's really difficult to unpack this because it's such an interwoven story. But there's
the fact that there's 4 chapters as well, and each chapter is so dense in itself.
Totally. Well, in the first chapter, obviously, the is it Maluda or Maluidia or whatever?
Maluda.
Maluda is part of the Corpse Brigade. So she's part of like the commoner gathering side of things. And there's a chap called Argath who no one likes, who you rescue. Yeah, well, you like him, do you?
I'm the sole Argath enjoyer in the world.
so it's interesting because he's a nobleman and he's been kidnapped by the Corpse Brigade. You rescue him from the Corpse Brigade because they're seen as the enemy because you're the nobleman's at the beginning. And then you go and fight Maluda, and then realize that she's not really your enemy. She's got some things in common with you. And throughout the battle, which is probably the first really interesting battle in the game, it's a really good little setup. You've got like I don't know what the name of the place is. There's like a little area where they're protected by like a little drawbridge and a little fort. She's got mages protecting her, and I think it's the first battle in the game where you've got an objective that's not kill everyone. You've got to just defeat her. And at the end, Ramza lets her go, even though Argath or Argos or whatever his name is, Argath wants her to wants her to be killed. Ramza's like, why are you killing her?
It's not even just Argath wants her to be killed. I mean, up at this point, we kind of already know that Argath is a bit of a shit, so to speak. The classist. Boy is incredibly classist, like to insane degrees. But like, I was really quite shocked on the amount of vitriol that he actually speaks in his little post-battle speech to Ramza. I mean, Maluda essentially says, like, you won't give me an honorable warrior's death. I'll make sure that you regret this. And Algath absolutely unleashes this torrent of, you aren't worth living. You're a fucking animal. How dare you even think that you're fit to breathe the same air as us? Meanwhile, Delete is standing there like, what the hell am I doing? And Rams is just like,
I mean, like it's interesting how that you've got the two sides of this war are you've got your noblemen and your commoners, and you've got Ramza and Delita are on both either side of that. They're both stuck in the middle, whereas this guy is clearly on one side. But when they helped him, they're fighting this Corpse Brigade, so it made sense for them to help him, because then the next twist, which I think was fascinating, when I got to this, I thought this is just incredible. Like, Delita's sister's kidnapped by the Corpse Brigade, Tietra, because they think she's a noblewoman when she's not. Like, right, which is mind-blowing. But it's the Corpse Brigade, and then the next battle, Argath buggered off. I think Argath's been kicked out by Ramza because he's a classist piece of shit. And then you go and fight Maluda, but you kill her. And it's interesting how it has nothing to do with Argath just wanting her dead. It's for completely different reasons. It's not like you're agreeing with him. You're killing the woman for a different reason, which is just like, what am I playing? This is just completely like...
Yeah, it's so... Like I know I'm going to be saying this a lot, but it's just so convoluted and so dependent on so many different factors. And this is something we're going to be jumping back and forth so much. And I feel like I should be apologizing to listeners for this in advance, because I've written a mini essay on Maluda about this, like her legacy within the story. I've a lot of thoughts on the different chapters. So Maluda and her legacy in that case, like, She's, for those unaware, she is the sister of the leader of the Corpse Brigade, who is, yes, Wiegraf, who was incorrectly translated. His name should have been Wiglaf, to go with the
Wiglaf.
No, I'm 100%. It should have gone with the Beowulf that you can later pick up. And Wiglaf is a character in the Beowulf saga. Yeah. Unfortunately, Wiegraf has stayed. It sounds better than Wiglaf anyway. So Maluda is the sister of Wiegrafals, and Wiegraf and Maluda are two very interesting characters. Obviously, they are both corpse brigades. They are both commoners who fought in the 50 Years' War and have come out of it without reparations and have essentially been spat on by the nobility, and they want their fair dues, which isn't a terrible thing to want, but the nobility says it is, so they are completely derided for it, essentially. The difference between them, however, is just absolutely fascinating to me, like genuinely endlessly fascinating, because Wiegraf is the kind of person of my ideals matter more than the individuals carrying them out. At one point, one of Wiegraf's sergeants, corporals, I don't know if there are like specific ranks within the actual corpse brigade, but comes up to Wiegraf and says like, look, the men are starving, we cannot carry on like this. And Wiegraf's retort is essentially, we have to topple the monarchy because nothing will change. And it's like, you can see the future, but you cannot see what is directly in front of you. Meanwhile, Maluda actively says at some point, like, you don't know what it's like to be hungry. I've had only bean broth to eat for weeks at a time. I don't necessarily hold you being born into nobility against you, but you are still ignorant to the crimes that your class perpetuates, and I want my fair dues because of that. And I don't care who you are or what you say that you're working for a better world. Fucking prove it then. Like, that's the big difference between them. And I think it's very telling that Maluda is who the party encounters first instead of Wiegraf, because if you encountered Wiegraf at this point in time, you'd probably be more inclined to agree with Algoth in that he's kind of just talking shit. But Maluda is so important to recognize the individual's cause and the attempt at peasant revolution, to the point that even though after her second fight, when she dies, she's never spoken about in the story again.
I know,
ever. But she is not forgotten about the story because her work is immediately picked up by Delita. The very first time that you encounter her, when she says like, you're a noble, I'm not, but that doesn't make you better than you. Delita is there, and Delita is taking in like, I was born a commoner, and the fact that I stand at this nobleman's side, that doesn't really mean shit. Maluda's words get into Delita, and then they don't necessarily change his course, but her story becomes his story. Every single part of him is then made up of like her regret. Sure, Delita's actions and rage and everything is not just Maluda's story. Like, he absolutely has his own
motivations and
reactions to things that are going on, but ultimately I don't think he would have ended up doing the things he did if they hadn't met Maluda. If Teacher had died and he wasn't already hyper aware of his place now at Rams's side and how peasants think about him indirectly even, I don't think he would have had exactly the same reaction. It's just, tactics is one of those things where there's just so many things that if something happened differently, the whole story would have changed.
Yeah, totally agree with that. What I find interesting though is that it's the most human story, and that might sound a bit pretentious because we talked about it before, but there are, again, sound too philosophical, there's kind of two types of people. You get people that are so entrenched in their own view that they've been taught, and no matter what's in front of them, they will stick to that view. And then you get people that react to what happens around them and change their minds. And you see that in life, right, across the patch. And then people have different views about different things and stuff like that. But like, these people that are noble have been told that the riffraff outside, they don't deserve it. And then you get the other side of it, where you've got some of the nobles that have been fighting with these people that realize they haven't got recompense and they're starving. And you in both of those worlds, you've got people that cannot see the nobles for anything more than being the toffs. And then you've got the other way around, where the nobles can't see them as any more than animals. That happens in the world still to this day. But then you get the people that really run the world are the ones that see what's in front of them, go, let's do something about it. And it's just such a shame that it takes a war for that to happen, which is just so true.
Just like the real world.
Depressingly true to life, isn't it, really? And of course, it's because people are so dogmatic with their approach to things. People just sometimes just get lost. And sometimes that's important to be like that, to get things done. But at the same time, it's like, something in front of you, like this person here. I mean, that's the point. I think that first battle with Maluda, where it's Delita's like, I don't think this woman's our enemy. And of course, then Argath is like, who cares? Whatever, let's just kill her because she's a dog. Tying it in with the gameplay side of things, because there's a couple more gameplay things I want to talk about. And I think it's very difficult to unpick it and talk about the gameplay and story separately, because each map has its own character as well. And each place you meet people is just it's like a little play every time you go to different areas, which I think is incredible.
That's exactly the word that I want to use for it as well.
So I mean, we'll talk about, just jump back a bit, because I think gameplay wise, the first couple of matches, should we say, because the way this is structured, just to sort of pull us back a bit, is we've got a world map, which is pretty much just like you're walking along a world map, Where's Wally style, basically like an open map, and you're along these points and you run backwards and forwards between them. Actually, very, very similar to Final Fantasy 16, the way they got their map set up, which is quite interesting. Clearly an influence on that game. And then, of course, you go into battle. Sometimes you have random encounters, which are in different locations, but mostly it is set battles at certain locations. Each of them is like a puzzle on how you beat that area. And of course, because of this game, you can customize your party so much. It is very difficult to find walkthroughs in this game, because you can find them, but it's very difficult to go, well, I've chosen to make a bunch of mages. I've chosen to make a bunch of archers. And the first interesting area that I remember thinking, I'm stuck, what am I doing? And I had to really think about how the game worked, look up online tutorials on how to do it, was, I can't remember the name of the town, but it's effectively the town where you first encounter some black mages, you first meet the corpse brigade. You're dead instantly because these black mages attack you. And then you realize you need to use the environment to sort of stuff. You get some archers to jump up on the roof and use those archers to take on the area, and think about it tactically and strategically. And I think that's notoriously the point where a lot of people give up. I certainly didn't. I think I made 5 attempts on that level. And I think it might be the next battle, or a couple later, but it's when you first fight Maluda in a little keep. And what Maluda does is she brings some white mages forward to buff her, and then some black mages to attack you aside. And what they do is they've boxed you into an area where you have to be together with each other. And the strength the black mages have in this game, and the white mages, but the black mages as attackers have, is that most of all of their spells are area of effect. So if you're bunching close to each other, you're screwed. So you see, basically you play it like a puzzle. Well, okay, I've gone through that way. How do I do it this time? And try and play things differently, which I think is really, really fascinating. It gives an extra dimension to the story in a sense, and it makes it more real, because you effectively are using the environments how they would be used in real life. It makes it more challenging, and it speaks to their character as well, because she's, someone like Maluda, she was one of those people we described. She can see what's in front of her. You mentioned the conflict between someone that has a dogmatic belief. She's got her beliefs, but they're based off what is in front of her eyes. That's so cleverly woven into the game design. She's in a fort. Out in the field, she'd be vulnerable and they'd hammer her. But in a fort, she's got the advantage, which is a much more practical and clever way of looking at things. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. And it's obviously not just that battle that little things like that pop up in, but like the actual story battles, there are so many indications of gameplay and story integration like that. I'm thinking of the battle right at the end of chapter 1 in Zeekton Fortress, when you're fighting against, the snowy one, when you're fighting against Argath when he's in the opposition party. Something very interesting to note there is that if Delita is knocked down to 0 HP, he gets back up and starts fighting again. At 1 HP, and you don't get a choice in that whatsoever. You do not control Delita. He is just a guest party member in that fight, but his refusal to die just so that he can make sure that Argath is killed. There are so many little things like that. There's a later fight where you're rescuing a new party member, Rafa, and she's just had something happen to her, which is like kind of rocked her world. And you have to kill all the enemies on the field while making sure that she doesn't die. Rafa's AI in that fight is suicidal, completely in keeping with how she actually would be. And it's hard to keep her alive. Like, it's little things like that which elevate this game from, an interesting tactical experience, which is, it's not necessarily my favorite kind of genre, but I can absolutely see how people would find fun in playing extra chess 2, shall we say. But to then actually go, well, if I treat these chess pieces like they're real living breathing people on top of that, it adds a whole extra dimension to the game, which is just fascinating to the 10th degree.
Well, it's interesting as well, because going back to the again, I'm terrible with place names, but the snowy bit, that's you going off the point I was making there about Maluda hiding in a fort and using the environment to her advantage. Argath does the opposite. He's out in the open, because he's like, no one can beat me. And it's so cleverly designed like that. Of course, interesting in that battle as well with Delita, he goes straight in. No matter what you do, he just goes for the kill. And it's clearly programmed that way, that these characters will do certain things. And it's interesting as well, some of the guest characters you have. I noticed this when I got into the second chapter, so that's the end of the first chapter, and most of the characters you've had up until that point will heal you and help you. You get into the second chapter, which is actually further. You've had a bit of a flashback for chapter 1. Chapter 2 is the current day. The people you're with, they will. I mentioned before that the magic is area of effect. They're quite happy to just throw magic at people that are next to you. Don't care.
Nope,
Whereas
don't give a
the
shit.
characters at the beginning like are very careful not to do that sort of thing, which I think is just like, okay, you've actually programmed this AI to be
Dickheads.
to be dickheads, yeah, to be more about themselves and not necessarily try and stitch you up, but not care you're in the friendly fire sort of range. The bit that really sums up, and this is quite early on, this bit in chapter 2 when you go to the is it Zershell Falls where you first meet. I think it's the first time you meet the princess. Is it Avilia?
So. Yeah.
So again, we're going to go through the entire story, but essentially, like they're on a waterfall. There's a little bridge across a waterfall. You're with your company, which is Rams's company, and he's with a guy called Gafgarian and Agrius. We love Agrius, and she's great. And effectively, they're part of this sort of like mercenary group that are coming along. They find the princess, and they're like, let's take her from whatever the enemy is. I can't remember, is it the Northern Brigade or the Southern Brigade? I can never remember which one's which, but basically, exactly.
Honestly, even I struggle with the names.
Take it from the enemy, and then all of a sudden, Gafgarian betrays you, and he's now working for someone else. And it's like, what? And then Delisa comes out of nowhere and goes, I'll help you. And it's like, what is going on? Who's working for who? But that battle is to try and keep the princess alive, Avilia. Now, the counter to the character you just mentioned there before is Avilia's actually, she will come along and hide and get protected by you and then buff herself up and heal herself because she wants to live. Yeah. So it's this kind of character difference of like, actually, no, it's far easier to be. And of course, I remember like thinking, right, I really get this game now, because that's the point where what happens is that the main villains gather on the bridge and you can just area of effect them with some fire and just hammer them. And it's quite clever how the game becomes very, I mean, funny enough, Final Fantasy Tactics becomes very tactical and very, very like, you go into some battles thinking, how can I cope with all these soldiers that are twice my level attacking me? But you have to use the environment and the skills you have to trap them, which I think is really, really cool. And it makes it more, like I say, even if you took the storyline out of it, it makes the game as enjoyable.
No, absolutely.
Moving on to the deeper into the battle system, because like, yes, because as we sort of said, like, it's difficult that we can have an entire episode just on the story, we can have an entire episode just on the battle system. I think it's one of the only Final Fantasy games where I think it really nails both of them, 10 out of 10. So Matsuno wanted to design the tactics battle system himself, but writing the story ended up taking up all of his time, which is clearly obvious because he's a genius. I love Matsuno. Hiroyuki Ito, you mentioned earlier, stepped in. Now, Hiroyuki Ito famously developed the ATB system in Final Fantasy, which came up before in the last episode, but also tweaked the job system, which we've not spoken about too much yet, which first appeared in Final Fantasy 3, but he added ability points in 5. The differences between the battle systems, like 3 was more basic. What's interesting about this version of the job system is that you get generic XP points and then you get job points, which actually is your ability points in the techniques in that job. But it's different because the job progression is more open in this game. So if you get to level 2 as a squire, I know this is different in both versions of the game, but if you get to level 2 as a squire, for example, you can become an archer. And then if you get to level 3 as an archer, you can become a ninja. But there's multiple paths you can take getting to the ninja. And you can also keep some of the abilities as part of that job class that might not be as effective, but there are abilities that let you, for example, I can't remember the name of the ability, but monk, obviously you're a physical attacker. There is an ability in the monk job that you can use that lets you still do physical attacks if you're a different class. So it's, there's quite a lot of nuance to that. And it's, there's a clear path on getting to the next end of the job cycle. There's obviously two sides to it. And the way that the system is built is around bravery and faith. So the bravery stat, better damage with physical attacks, better chance of reaction abilities like first strike and counter and stuff like that happening. But a low bravery stat, the players threaten to leave the party if you get to a low bravery stat, which I think is quite interesting.
It's the same with the too high faith stat as well.
That's right. So the faith and bravery are kind of like attack and defend in a sense. It's a really strange one because while I was playing this game, the football was on. I was noticing that they got the defense and attack of a typical basic invasion game of like, we're attacking their end, they're attacking our end. This isn't quite as clear cut as that because faith helps with magic and not just defense. So, but it has that kind of like balance off, is that a higher bravery and a lower faith, or a lower bravery and a higher faith. Ramsey, your main character, is pretty much locked in at 70 at both, so he's good at both. Those stats can change for various things you get throughout the game. Essentially you want to kind of try and make your main physical attackers have a higher bravery stat and your main mages have a higher faith attribute. But it's risk and reward because they can do more damage with their magic, but they also get hit by magic more. So it's a really, that's kind of the crux of the game, though, is that once you learn that and understand that, which took me the first couple of hours, I had to reset and start again because I realized that I was, screwing things up. Once you've realized that it makes more sense that, your characters with more of a faith are going to go down the mage route, your characters with more of bravery are going to go down the physical attacker route. There's a status effect called faith, funny enough, in this game, which means the faith goes to 100
Jesus. Suddenly I'm a pious man and I can no longer engage in battles.
Well, no, but they are super mages, so they can like burn things down, but they're super susceptible. So pretty much they're like, that's a real, trade-off. And then the other side is atheist, right? Makes it zero, makes your faith stat 0, but you have super resistance to spells.
Huh, okay.
So it was like this religious stuff cannot hurt me kind of stuff. Like Neo in the Matrix, like sort of pretty much. But the two attributes lend themselves to the different types of jobs you can get. So the 3 types being physical orientated jobs: squire, knight, archer, monk, thief, all that kind of stuff. Magic oriented jobs: chemist, white mage, which was priest in the original version, which we'll talk about the translation differences in a minute. Black mage or wizard. He looks more like a wizard, to be fair. Mystic, time mage. And then you get the special jobs. So for your guest characters, these really are, which is Holy Knight, Fell Knight, Cleric, Machinist, which is an engineer, things like that. So again, I mean, I think it's really interesting how this gives you an open slate for a game, but that's pretty much the balance of the game. As soon as you understand that, you can pretty much just play in the sandbox and do what you want with stuff. You can go in and do the typical thing of, like in Final Fantasy 1, which was the first game to technically contain the job system. It didn't really have a changeable job system, but you could, famously play that game with like 4 white mages or 4 black mages or 4 warriors or whatever. And this you can do the same if you really want to.
I do have a question for you here. There is a character whose faith stat actually changes throughout the game. Do you know who that is?
Right? I didn't know. I didn't notice that.
So it's Deleter. His faith stat is kind of like middling at best anyway when he's a guest party member in chapter 1. His faith stat drops after Zeekton. When he watches his sister die.
He believes less. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And then again, after a later reveal about Avelia's heritage, his faith drops again then. However, his faith then later rises close to its initial levels again after he reconciles with Avelia, which is just such an interesting, like, okay, so in a game that is very... Initially, it isn't given to us as like a particularly religious story, and even when the church gets involved, it's not especially religious. But for faith to be not just such an important stat in battle, but actually like ludonarratively as well, is so fascinating. Like they really popped off with this one.
It's interesting this because you'll probably be able to talk more about this because you mentioned before. From what I understand, in general, the female characters, you can have female and male characters in this game. The female characters generally have a lower bravery stat and a higher faith stat.
I believe so.
The male characters are the other way around. Now, part of me was a little bit disappointed with that because I really wanted to just go in with a bunch of like paladin super women knights and just kick ass because I love that idea of it. And interestingly, a lot of the characters are female knights in this game. But I think I've been thinking about this the last couple of days because on the face of it, that's quite sexist. But then again, it's a medieval setting. So that might be not a bad thing in a sense that it's representative of the times and what to do with how things are because obviously that's part of the classist and patriarchal world that is of that sort of environment. So
no, absolutely. And one of the notes that I made from my very first playthrough of this a couple of years ago was like, I actually have, obviously I'm as a person, I'm completely against sexism and racism and classism. Like isms are a bad thing. That's the bottom line there. In a setting like this, I actually have no qualms about it being a sexist or classist society. It makes sense. It fits in with the world. It gives it more meat. It's still very frustrating. And especially with Final Fantasy's history of you get 3 women in the party and one of them is going to be a love interest and give me money about it, because that kind of is a very common thread amongst Final Fantasies, and that's something that I'll probably talk at a later date.
Yeah.
But that is something that's like there are only ever really 3 main female characters in a Final Fantasy game.
Sometimes they start a band.
And sometimes they start a band. As far as tactics goes, it really makes sense in this, yes, very patriarchal, very feudalistic society. There's a line later on. One character says, "How I wish I'd been born a man like you." It's like, okay, well, we have firsthand knowledge looking at Agrias, looking at another female knight character. You don't need to be a man to do whatever you want. Really, like, there's Maluda, who obviously fought in the 50 Years' War. She then became like a peasant revolutionary. You have Agrias, who is a female knight. You have Meliadul, who's also a female knight wearing a habit. Like, it's not that Ivalice itself says you can't do this if you're a woman, but at the same time, it feels like it's also an outlier. Like, it feels like there are two camps that you can fit into if you're a woman in this setting. You have the good girls. This is Ophelia and Alma and Teacher. You know, you have your pious girls who go to school and they're quiet and they're well-meaning and well-mannered and they do exactly, you know, what's asked. They're the noble women, essentially. And then you have what I've been calling the good girls gone bad, because they don't fit into that. Yeah, they don't fit into that traditional idea of femininity. They're the people who pick up swords. They're the people who fight against the world at large. And it's a really interesting blend of like feudalism and the semi-realism that we're given in this, and point blank anachronism and stuff that's absolutely made up. It gives you a really good overall look at what it's like to be a woman in Ivalice. You know, that information isn't given to us directly. You have to infer it yourself. Like, Argrius could be anyone, Maluda could be anyone, but they gave themselves to the blade and then made sure that they had to hold themselves strictly in that role. Whereas if you're someone like Alma, presumably the only things that you really have to look forward to are nobility or motherhood or celibacy if you want to remain in, and I don't want to call Aubon a monastery because that implies that it would be an all-male, the abbey, essentially. This character says, I wish I had been born a man like you, and 9 words reads the setting for fucking filth. If she was a man, she could make whatever choices she wants, even if she was led down the path of heresy, even if she was led away from family, even if it takes her away from everything she's ever known. She could do that of her own volition, but then she doesn't really have that choice, even though she does. It's a very interesting...
No, it is.
Not quite a look at, because it's not something that's actually viewed as important in the text so much as just this character wishes that her situation was a little different, and then everyone else gets a completely different world to and sandbox to work and play in, I suppose. And again, it's not something that I necessarily deride. I think it absolutely brings a lot more meat to the setting overall. It's just one of those things that, like, I start thinking about it and it won't leave me alone. You know?
Totally. Agris is great. I think I did like female characters. I like well-written characters, right? And I think one-dimensional characters, if they are written very, very well, can be good. But I don't tend to like one-dimensional characters. Like if they're a religious zealot that's a one-dimensional character and they are hyper hammy and over the top, that's great. But I do like my more, because people can be like that, you know what I mean? They are human, but I like nuanced. And at first I was a little bit disappointed that they had that, you know, idea that women were, the girls are more faith and the guys are more physical attack, because I wanted to have a party of super assassin women. Like, yeah, exactly. That's my favorite sort of character in these games. I think it's great.
I do think it's interesting that you say you really like Agris, though. Don't get me wrong, I like Agris as well, but I also went into tactics going, I can't wait to learn more about Agris. And then what was actually given to me in the game was surprisingly less than I thought there was going to be. She has her moments in the very small parts that she's around for in chapter 1 and then in chapter 2, and then she doesn't really have anything. Not really there. She's not important to the rest of the story. But that's not just Agrius, that's a lot of the characters. That's a main criticism I have with tactics.
Because like her kind of like main thing is to protect the princess. Yeah. So she almost kind of becomes an extension of that, which is a little bit disappointing, isn't it? Because effectively she becomes like a prop in a sense.
Yeah. But again, like, this is a criticism that I have with most of the characters in tactics, actually.
Not fleshed out as much as they could be. Which is because there's so many of them.
Yes.
and again, it's one of those things where it's like, I'm going to mention like Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon again because it's on, and because it deals with that stuff of, a female in a medieval world, you know what I mean? And it's interesting that we've got the modern takes on some things, and people you get people complaining because they're idiots about stuff that are like, I can't believe they've got a woman playing this character in series because they're just silly people. What's wrong with them? House of the Dragon is an allegory for the anarchy, which happened right in English history, and effectively it was a battle between Empress Matilda and I think it was Stephen. He had more of a backing because the nobility didn't like women or didn't trust women, because women had never been able to show themselves in that setting. So it's kind of like that's the same thing here in a sense, is that, and it's not as overt here, but it's kind of like that thing of like, well, you're a woman, what do you know? It's like, well, I might not know stuff about this because we've never given the opportunity to be brought up into this environment. There's a part in House of the Dragon where they're having a pop at someone because, what do you know about battle? And it's great because Rhaenyra, the character, turns around and says, well, what do you know about battle? We've been at peace for 50 years just because you're a bloke. And it's really interesting how, like, actually it's perceptions. And it goes back to the point we were making before about, people's beliefs based off of what they've seen. If they've had no opportunity to see that thing happen, they're going to defer to their beliefs, which is sometimes annoying, but sometimes it's like understandable why, which I think is the point you're making about this world. It works in this world. What I find really interesting, now I'm going to jump onto the ending now, right?
Okay.
Are you ready?
Boy, I'll get my tissues ready.
Yeah. So the ending, The overarching thing I took away from the ending, spoilers and turn off now if you don't want to hear what happens at the end. There's lots going on.
There's a lot going on.
Winding back to the beginning of the story where Arazalam finds, oh my god, this Ramza was a heretic and what's going on? Maybe he was more involved. And then you go and see what's effectively probably maybe even Arazalam's interpretation of it, and maybe it didn't happen that way. Effectively, you've got Delita, who starts off as a commoner, plays both sides against each other, ends up at the end, and then marries Avilia and then kills her. Yeah,
killing her is up for debate. Actually, I don't believe that
defends himself, or
I don't believe that Avilia actually has a specific fate, and I like it that way.
Oh, okay. But he ends up attacking her after she attacks him because she realizes he's a bit of a shit. Whereas Ramza spends all his time cutting through the nobility because he has to, or because it's the right thing to do, and then rides off into the sunset with his sister.
Does he?
Or does he? Again, it is open to interpretation. But with that interpretation, that the idea of that is that's seen from people's perspectives. Has that happened because no one else is there, or whatever? Or they see people riding past on the chocobos. I think at the end of it's a funeral, isn't it? There's a funeral, and Ramza and
Alma.
That's it, Alma. Yeah. They ride off on chocobos. It's like, is that them? And the implication is it might be them, but it might not be them.
Yeah.
But if you take that as read, that's what happens. And I think the last line that Delita says is that which one of us won, or something like that.
Oh,
yeah.
The ending quote.
Yeah. What's the actual quote then? Go on, let's throw it.
So I can only speak for the War of the Lions version. I don't know what it is in the PSX version, but after he retaliatory strikes Avilia, he walks off and says to the sky, "Did you get your end in all of this, Ramza? Yeah. I got this."
Yeah, totally. So
then the screen turns black.
Yeah. Now the point is that effectively what it comes down to, right? And this is quite an emotional like thing.
I was sobbing. I was full on like tears.
I can't remember where, maybe I read this in something extra or something like that, but it's that point of what matters more, what people think of you or what you think of you. Yeah. And that's pretty much what it comes down to, isn't it? Because effectively, like Delita, there's a point I think earlier on in the story, it's certainly in the War of the Lions cutscenes, which are different than the original cutscenes, where Delita says, "I'm never going to be rewarded for my work because I'm a commoner." But he seeks that, he wants that, he wants to be recognized, and he wants other people to think well of him. And then eventually it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where he becomes the king and everyone thinks he's the king. But he doesn't get any personal retribution because of how he's treated everyone along the way. Whereas Ramza is the opposite. He ends up going away and basically becoming a commoner and doing what he wants, if you interpret that the ending the way it is. And everyone thinks he's a flipping villain. But he's like, do I care? People can think of me what they want.
And this is where tactics went from being really good to just being fucking outstanding. Ramza is not a complicated character whatsoever, but his role in the story is very complicated insofar as he's trying to find out what it means to be his role within a world like this. Ultimately his character kind of ended, or his character arc closed for me after the battle in Egros Castle, where he speaks the line, "House Vale is no more, but what does it matter? We are the sum of our deeds, not our names."
That's the quote.
That elevated Ramza from being like, okay, kind of a naive person trying to do his best, to this guy fucking gets it. Like, this guy fucking gets it, and I kind of really adore him as a character. And on the flip side, Delita is not a complicated man, really, but when you try and pin down exactly what makes him so uncomplicated, he becomes the messiest motherfucker out there. Like, there are so many parts of his character that don't necessarily agree with other things that he does, but altogether they make up Delita. There was one thing that I saw, which was just a screenshot of two different sites, and both of them were just, so is Delita a good guy or a villain? And it's like, you've missed the point of tactics. You've completely missed the point of tactics. It's not about whether or not Delita is a villain. It's about whether or not his legacy was worth every single step that it took for him to get here. It was whether all of those dead bodies and their lives being cut short were worth his ambitions. And ultimately, we know from Arslan's prologue that Delita ended up being a good king. He reigned for a long time and he was actually well loved. Was any of the stuff that he did to get to that position worth that love and legacy in the end? And that's something that's so deeply personal for every single person that plays this game, that it's just like, oh, tactics, you've done it. You've done it.
he settles for only existing in other people's minds. That's the point, isn't it? It's about what's more important. I'm going to mention a Star Trek quote now. There's a Star Trek Next Generation episode where effectively it's set in the 24th century, and a time traveler who leads them to believe he's from the 29th century. It turns out he isn't, but he leads everyone to believe he's from the 29th century, comes in, and then there's an event that's happening, and Captain Picard turns around and says to him, how do I solve this? What's the problem? Because you can't change history. And there's a quote he says, which is, I will accept history's judgment. And the point of that is that he wants to do the right thing. He's in control of his destiny in front of him. You know, and it's that kind of thing is like, you know, if you could go back and change something awful, would you do it? It's like, maybe you would. It's a situation where what's more important, how people view you and think of you moving forward, or what you can do in the room, and what's really living is being able to make changes. And that's what the whole idea of being alive is, to be able to make changes, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's the whole point of like Ramsay gets it. He takes that view of like, you know what everyone writes down and thinks and considers of me is only up to them. That's there. And then what's great about it is the fact that this guy's Arazalam has found this stuff 500 years later, and it's like, does it really matter now? What happens?
Like, this is so long in the past that none of this is important.
So the point is like, you know, grab your life by your flipping horns. And of course, what's interesting is that, Ramsay goes off with his sister and Delita doesn't. You know, you could argue that was unlucky and it wasn't because of his own actions, but it's like one of those things of like, well, actually, you know, like Ramsay gets the ending that Delita wanted, doesn't he?
Yeah. I think something else that's also really important to consider about the ending, after having said all that about, you know, it's not about whether Delita was a villain or whether Ramsay got the right end or whatever. I think it's also very worth noting that whether or not you personally think that Delita was right or wrong or villainous or well justified in his actions, Delita himself is actively, you are given the answer in the narrative, because it's Ovelia who takes the action of stabbing him and saying, you did the wrong thing, you used these people, and this is the result of your actions. That was kind of the culmination of the entire story for me, Ovelia actually being it, because Ovelia is my favorite character in Tactics. She is so young and so sheltered and so uncertain, and despite being so important to the future of Ivalice, she is never at the center of that discussion herself, even if she's in the vicinity. She's detached from her circumstances because she has no other recourse but to be. You know, when Delita decides that he's going to build a kingdom worthy of her, he's the one deciding that, not her. And the fact that at the very end of things, it's Ovelia who decides that no, he took the wrong path, that to me is the narrative itself condemning Delita's actions. And I think that's, again, in itself just so fascinating that the narrative actually does give you an answer. Whether or not you agree with it is a completely different thing entirely.
Deep stuff.
Sorry, I could just wax lyrical about this game until the end of time.
It's incredible, isn't it, really? I mean, like, what's interesting about this game as well is that because it's so nuanced, is you can have the story spoiled, but you can play it and then see different aspects of it going through it. Because the whole point isn't like, it's not good and evil, it's about different people's different lives and perspectives and stuff like that. You know, there's so much more we can talk about, those different characters and stuff like that. And we haven't even really mentioned the flipping. Well, funny enough, like we mentioned at the beginning about the more supernatural element of it, we haven't really touched upon that.
I was just about to say, actually, it's exactly these things which make the early part of the story just so much more important than anything else that happens. Like, sure, the church is there, sure, the Lucathi are planning to like drown the whole world in blood, and sure, you have to go and stop them as Ramsay, but like that stuff is just so, it's not that it's not interesting to me, it's just not important in the grander scheme of things, in my opinion. Like, they really, really could have done away with it and the game would have stood up on its own.
It's interesting, we mentioned about the femininity and being a female in that world and stuff like that. Again, I keep going back to Game of Thrones, and I think the reason I keep going back to that is that it has that same element of what's written down and you know, over a vast continent, and people have got different perspectives on what's actually happened and what they believe's happened and stuff like that, which is something that's very prevalent here. So for example, Ramsay effectively, he sacrifices his own legacy for his own happiness, which is very interesting.
It's very noble of him, actually.
Very noble.
For a character that starts noble born and then ends up throwing that all away, he remains very noble of heart.
But here's the question for you. So you mentioned about, you know, the choices open to women in that environment. If a woman were to have done that, how would it have been perceived? I mean, obviously you'd argue it's not perceived by anything because he's gone off. But you understand what I mean? Is it like he's viewed as a heretic and whatever? He's a knobhead. But if a woman had done that, wouldn't it have been more that, you know, she's a witch and horrible, and actually she's the embodiment of the evil? Because the idea of a heretic is someone that's, you know, well, we're just going to excommunicate him. You know, less said about him, the better. Whereas if it had been a woman, it probably would have been, she's the world's worst horrible person in the universe, everything. One of the most fascinating figures in history to me is Boudica, right? So Boudica's rebellion, for those who don't know, was something that happened after the Roman invasion of Britain in 60 AD. Basically, Boudica was an Iceni queen. I think she attacked, was it Colchester and St Albans? And most of her family were killed, her daughters were killed and everything like that. And she flipping well went, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And the Romans didn't think that, that she'd be able to rebel, and she did. And she rallied the troops around to hammer the Romans and eventually lost. But what's really interesting about that story is that because the Iceni were not literate, or they couldn't write or whatever, there's no recorded history from their perspective. It's all from the Romans' perspective. Now, what I find fascinating about that is that they all recorded Boudica as being this hard as nails woman. Why would you big up your enemy? Like, that's what I find fascinating about it, because there's only two reasons: either because it actually happened and she actually was hard as nails, which I want to believe, or because it was this element of like, let's big up this group of people as being so hard that we didn't stand a chance. That we didn't stand a chance. That there was, so it's this incredible like perspective of propaganda and history and stuff like that. But that's created a British history and British story that the Brit can't get us down. It's kind of like, it's one of those, and it's based off a woman as well, which I think is fascinating. Which is one of the best figures in history to me. Who knows exactly what happened, but and I love that. I think it's just something worth mentioning because it ties in with the real history. You know what I mean? History is written by the victors. Unless you've got both sides telling that side of the story, then effectively you don't know what happened. But
like I said before as well, because this is all second and third person stuff within the actual universe itself. Like, there's no way that you could ever say for certain that this is absolutely what happened. Everything about tactics is so fascinating. It really is. Like, anyone out there, if you want to talk to me about tactics, please, by God, come to me. I don't know if you've noticed, but
you quite like this game, yeah.
I do quite like this game. My username Adramelech as well comes from Adramelech, the Wrath. That would be the loop of eye associated with Capricorn, which is the astrological sign that I was born under. The only reason that I went for Adramelech was, partially because I could shove my name in there and it sounded like the actual thing anyway, but also because who doesn't love a big lightning goat dude? It's fucking awesome. It's raw as hell.
Adolphus appears in this game as well, doesn't he?
It does. Count Adolphus Orlando.
He comes back in 16.
In 14 as well. So to bring this back to 14, as we were talking about very, very briefly about in the beginning, I don't know if you're aware, but there is actually a set of raids in Final Fantasy 14 called the Return to Ivalice raids.
Of course there is.
Which was actually co-written by Yasumi Matsuno himself. They adapted the Evolution legend to fit with the 14 setting and created a bunch of raids that were based on it. They are incredibly fun. They are some of my favorite raids in the entire game. The characters were tweaked slightly. The history was tweaked slightly. The Ramza that we're given in the game is an absolute dickhead, and that was my first interaction with Ramza. So to come off of 14's Ramza going, oh, this guy's a dick, and going into tactics and going, oh, I like Ramza now. What the hell has happened? Was a hell of a experience. But yeah, you can fight Sid Orlando in 14 as well, and that fight is so much fun.
One thing I mentioned on the War of the Lions version, because there's lots to that, and I'm not going to unpack what exactly everything the port brings in. I know you can play as Bolthea.
Oh god, the less said about that, the better. They introduced a few additional characters, and none of them were necessary.
You can play as Bolthea in the War of the Lions version. You can play as Cloud in the original PS1 version. You can find them wandering out, and it's just quite interesting how they put a guest character in.
I believe they also introduced a character from, I think it's Tactics Advanced 2,
maybe A2, whatever it's called. I don't know.
Yeah, Luso. He was another character that, like, don't get me wrong, I like when I can say hello to other favorites, but like, they should stay in their own games, in my opinion. I didn't enjoy their inclusions in War of the Lions.
What was an interesting first for this game? Do you know? As a Final Fantasy game, what was a first for this?
Oh boy, I don't know. Hit me.
The first game not composed by Nobuo Uematsu.
Of course. Oh, of course, the soundtrack. How could I forget?
Yes. We always forget the soundtrack, except for the last episode.
We're very bad at that.
Except for the last one, because it was just too good not to talk about.
So it's very interesting, because apparently the composer for Final Fantasy Tactics was the same person who helped, I think, co-compose for Final Fantasy 12.
Makes sense. Well, they do all the Ivalice stuff, don't they?
Yes, and that was so surprising for me to find out, because Tactics soundtrack and 12 soundtrack are so completely different in style. Like, you can hear definitely there's some of the same elements being used, but overall, don't get me wrong, I do really quite like the 12 soundtrack, but compared to Tactics, it's utterly forgettable.
I agree.
Tactics soundtrack is sublime, honestly.
It's brilliant. It's fantastic. It's very different. I think Nobuo's work tends to be more character leitmotif based or location based. So obviously we talked about the theme of love in the last episode. Just an excuse to talk about that again. Is obviously the theme, Rose's theme, and you've got all the character themes in 8. No, all the character themes are in 9. 8 has sort of got character themes, but hasn't really. 7 has them. and it's associated with that person. As soon as you hear that bit of music, that Highwind's theme in 7. In this, there's some banging music in the battles, but it's not. It's more to do with what's happening in the story and how hyped things up and how tense things are.
Yeah.
And you get that kind of stop-start feel, especially if you go from being in a big battle to going back to the menu, and then the menu. It just feels very layered. So that sounds really pretentious, but you see what I mean? It's a different vibe. Whereas it's not as well. I can't necessarily hum as many of the tunes as I can with Final Fantasy 4 or Final Fantasy 9, but the music's got a different. And I think it works for this game. I think it's better than if it was done by Nobuo. I think, to be honest with you.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's very interesting that you bring up character themes there as well, because a lot of the characters do actually have themes within the soundtrack. I know.
Yeah.
I think most of the main players do. So that would be Ramza, Delita, Alma, and Ovelia all have themes. Cid Orlando as well, because why wouldn't you have a fucking theme for the Thunder God? But they are less used for those characters and more used within moments that character is around, I feel. So there's 2 renditions of Ovelia's theme, which I adore anyway. I think it's a great theme. But the first one I think is called just Ovelia's theme. The second one is called Ovelia's Trepidations or Ovelia's Worries, depending on which translation. And it has Delita's theme mixed in with it.
Oh, right.
And it's just so masterfully done that you don't recognize it on the first listen. And then you go back and you go, hang on a minute, there's more going on here. And of course, that's by that point, Ovelia and Delita are so inextricably linked that she doesn't get the chance to have her own theme anymore. Like it's just, you're right. This is so layered, and you could endlessly chew on it.
Totally. It's impossible to spam attacks to get through this game. It's like probably like that's the thing I've noticed with this. Like, and I found that like in the first, I really struggle with like tutorials, and I like the first level of this game is a tutorial, and it's like, I just want to get through it and get on, because there's like lots of guest characters in the first battle, and it holds your hand a lot, but it's annoying, and it's like, I just want to get through it, and I want to spam through it, because if you do that and then don't pay attention to what's going on, it becomes much of a struggle. I guess the same with a lot of RPGs, but like
it's much more pronounced on this.
On Final Fantasy 8, for example, I used to just spam all the GFs, because at the time it was like Pokemon was the thing, and it was just like using the summons, and that only gets you about into disc 2, and by that point you're just screwed basically. 9 was just, I played 9 afterwards, and then of course I got really screwed myself that because I didn't upgrade my weapons, because in 8 upgrading your weapons is important, in 9 equipment's king. So but you can get through the first chunk of the game. This you can't at all. Once you get to that battle with the mages in the big building with the archer on top, you cannot get through that unless you know what you're doing, which I think is quite interesting, because it probably makes it less accessible to people. But I think the people that are fans of this game, it's I want to say cult classic's probably not the right phrase. It's more, I don't know how to put it. The people that love this game love this game.
Yeah,
the people that don't like this game haven't played it.
Yes.
I got a 9 in Edge magazine as well, which is,
did it really?
You did. Good. Which is like that's always my guys on whether a game's good or not, because Edge is like the artistic, I guess. It looks the whole picture, as opposed to which is good. Like something getting a 9 is like, wow, Okay, well, we got a little bit more to talk about on tactics after the break, so see you in a minute. Okay, so we're back after that long break.
The last thing that I really want to talk about here is the translation of Final Fantasy Tactics, because as you know, it came out in 97, 98 for the PlayStation 1, and then again for PSP in 2007, and received not just a slight graphical upgrade and like slight overhaul to everything, but that everything includes the script.
The entire script.
The entire script. So this is something that's actually quite polarizing with fans on the internet, as I'm sure you have seen when you were doing your research for this episode. There are some people out there that absolutely despise the War of the Lions script, and there are some people out there that think that anyone that enjoys the PlayStation 1 script is doing so only because they have rose-tinted glasses on.
Oh, God.
Now, there is no right or wrong in this argument. I want to make that perfectly clear. If you like the original, you like the original. If you like the retranslation, you like the retranslation. But I did want to talk about the actual differences between them. If you listened to me speak about translations in the Final Fantasy IV episode, and you'll understand that I do enjoy this kind of stuff.
Really?
War of the Lions would never have guessed, would you?
No.
So War of the Lions was actually translated by the same people that worked on Final Fantasy XII, and obviously that comes across in the updated script, which more reflects that early modern English style of like the Shakespearean style that people like to call
stuff.
Yes. Now that kind of bothers me a little bit when it's called ye olde stuff.
Because that never happened. Yeah.
No, unfortunately, I'm a bit of a stickler like that. Not because it never happened, but because it doesn't feel particularly like they actually stuck to that era they have some archaic like turns of phrase, but for the most part, it's actually very normal language. There's not even any these or thous being used, for God's sakes. How early modern English can we really be without a thee or a thou in there? So the War of the Lions and Final Fantasy XII was translated by Alexander O. Smith and Joe Reeder, who both left Square Enix in 2002 to found their own translation company, and then later again founded a different company. So they're now working for a company called Bento Books. Reader's other credits for game localization include Tactics Ogre, Tactics Advance 2, Revenant Wings, the Dawn of Souls remake of Final Fantasies 1 and 2, and Final Fantasy X-2 as well.
What can I do for you? What can I do for thou? What can I do for thou?
There we go. Meanwhile, Smith's credits, other than Final Fantasy XII, include Vagrant Story, which I was surprised by. I didn't realize it was the same person, but makes sense if it's considered colloquially part of the Ivalice Alliance. He also worked on the Ace Attorney series, which really surprised me, as well as the Full Metal Alchemist light novel series, and he also helped co-translate some volumes of the Dr. Slump manga and Samurai Deeper Kyo manga.
You said the F word, you said Full Metal Alchemist, you brought it up.
Now, at the time, reviewers, and this is straight from Wikipedia, reviewers noted the high quality of Vagrant Story's English script, in which Smith utilized various archaic English idioms and slangs which distinguished the game from its straightforward Japanese counterpart. Now, this is something that he obviously brought forward to do in 12 and then again in War of the Lions, and it's something that I have noticed that fans actually take a lot of issues with, or fans of the original, I should say, mostly because in the original Japanese script, there isn't all this archaic fluff. Some stuff is translated and had stuff added to it that wasn't actually there in the original script. Some people don't like this change, and fair enough to them. I don't particularly mind it, but I can see why some people would prefer a straight translation over a localization. However, to the people that seem to think that localization is a useless talent, get real, please.
Yeah,
I'm begging you, get real.
Talent.
It's an incredible talent, and it's something that really shouldn't be overlooked. So some of the examples that I've been able to find here with the differences in the script. So one very, very iconic line, and this is from the very beginning of chapter 1. You have Delita, who in the original says, "Tough luck. Don't blame me. Blame yourself or God." Which is a very good, strong line, honestly. In the War of the Lions, that same line is translated as, "Forgive me, 'tis your birth and faith that wrong you, not I," which feels completely different, as I'm sure you'll agree. Now, there are a few other examples of things that have been translated differently within the actual game, where the whole feel of the scene has actually changed because of the translation. There were a couple of scenes that I watched the PSP cutscenes and then went back and actually compared it to the PSX things. The one that I'm going to talk about specifically is the scene on Fovelum Plains where Delita and Ramza are chatting and they whistle through grass together.
Oh, yeah.
So with the updated FMV, it doesn't feel out of place, but it can be hard to follow in places, which I think is true of a lot of the script in general for War of the Lions. Whereas the PSX version, because it's not a cutscene, you actively have to click through the dialogue to get to the next piece of text, which is very evocative as a game mechanic in itself. There's a point where Delita says that he's felt out of place for such a long time, and the game makes you then click past Ramza's uncomfortable silence as opposed to just letting it play out. Like that's a very important thing to me as far as like a gameplay integration. But then there's also the scene with Delita and Avelia in the ruins of the castle later on, where he says he'll rebuild Ivalice for her.
Yeah.
Now,
beautiful scene.
It's a gorgeous scene, like really hits
the lighting,
in the heart.
The lighting as well. It's just incredible. Yeah.
And compared with in the original with the sprite work, and then in the PSP version with Akihiro Yoshida's artwork having been realized in 3D as well. Like even if you prefer one over the other, they are still both absolutely. You can't deny
how beautiful that artwork is. It's incredible.
The language in that scene really changes the feel of it as well. Yeah. Like in the original PSX version, what Delita says to her is, "I'll make a country worthy of you. I'll make your life shine. Let me guide you." And earlier on, he says,
"Is this a dagger I see before me?"
Most people have to act the roles given to them. Then again, most of them haven't even noticed they're acting. No way I'd do that. Ooh. I won't be used. I'll be the one using, which is so strong of Delita to say. And like, it's a really shocking thing. Meanwhile, in the PSP version, it's a lot more flowery. You have to really read between the lines. He says, you know, I'm past all that now. I'm their unwitting puppet no more. And to Ivalice, he says, I'll burn down this kingdom and from its ashes build for you a new one, a kingdom worthy of you. I'll show you a world where your light will outshine the sun and you'll have no more need of tears. Like, it's still
more simpy fuckboy, isn't it, really?
it's still very evocative, but in such a different tone that like it really makes the whole thing feel different.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think one is greater over the other.
No.
Something that I actually mentioned to my best friend when we were playing through it for the first time is that because of the differences in script, I think something that would work really, really well would be to do what Tolkien does and actually mix the combination of high and low languages.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and that's something that you can see.
He was the master of that, wasn't he? So
well, Tolkien was just the master, full stop, I think. I think it would just be so much more evocative if you had all this flowery language from the Highborns and then you get Delita unable to really measure up to that, or to see people like Alga fall from that noble station to be as coarse as the peasants that he reviles. I think that would work really, really well. And with the rumors of a potential another remaster coming sometime this year, I'm really hoping that
I read that the other day.
Oh, it's exciting stuff, isn't it?
It's good, isn't it?
I really hope that if they do go for another translation, they're able to marry the two things a little closer. If not, I'll be happy with whatever they give me. I'm so excited to see what they do.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we talked about Shakespeare there, and I don't know if you got my subtle referencing the end of the game, but also Macbeth. I did Macbeth at school, and I did drama for years as well, apart off the back of playing Macbeth at school. And the way we were taught it, and I've always liked this, because I've always liked Shakespeare, but sometimes it can be a bit pretentious the way it's taught to you. Like, you must learn it in a certain way, right? I can't believe we got to Shakespeare. But so I've always hated A Midsummer Night's Dream, because there's a scene in A Midsummer Night's Dream which is basically talking about stage directions and exit stage left, but it's doing a play. So it's a play within a play, and it's a clever bit of English. You're watching a play within a play, and you've got to and they talk about exiting stage right, but they're actually talking about not exiting stage right. They're talking about the characters within the play exiting stage right, okay? Well, that's great as a piece of English and a bit of comedy, actually. But try to do that in a drama. So it's always a pretentious scene that drama teachers bring out. Oh, look how clever. It's like, you know what? This does not work if you're trying to teach kids to act. It works really well as a bit. And I remember it's annoyed me ever since because of that, right? So because of how it's been taught to you. So we did Macbeth at school, and we were in year 6, and we made the different locations in the classroom, and we're on the heath today. We'll move the tables over here. We're now on the heath today, or now we're at the castle. What we'd do is we'd have little bits of dialogue between two characters, and most of it would be like our colloquial English translation, but always keep at least one of the iconic lines from Shakespeare in. And it's quite funny, and the thing, I've still got the booklet from 22 years ago. It says, sorry to Shakespeare for all the changes we've made, but of course, for example, using that scene there, I remember there's a scene between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. Funny enough, in that scene in the classroom, I played Lady Macbeth, which is quite interesting. There's a line which is, screw your courage to the sticking place. That's the only line we kept. Everything else was just ad-libbed and written in. And we actually wrote it, and it was a really clever way of understanding what the scene is trying to put across.
Yeah.
But then you understand how clever the language is as well, if it's accessible to you.
See, I think it's also, since you brought up Shakespeare, I think it's also worth mentioning that,
that kind of worms. Sorry.
No, please. I think it's also worth mentioning, and I know this isn't forbidden knowledge or anything, but so many of Shakespeare's plays were meant to be so accessible to the lower class. They can be really difficult to read along to and understand if you don't have a lot of knowledge of what was going on at the time, or definitions of archaic words. But for the most part, if you sit down and watch a Shakespeare comedy without prior knowledge, you're still gonna laugh. You're still probably gonna get the dick jokes, because by God, he made a lot of those in there. It's not like it's completely inaccessible even to people in a modern age. And this is going back to something that you said earlier on, and is something that I picked up on very, very early in my being taken through Tactics for the first time. Tactics is an incredibly theatrical piece of work, from the fact that everyone has a little portrait.
Yeah.
Now, I wish that the portraits had different emotions expressed for different lines. Unfortunately, that's just how the game is. I can't change that, whatever. But from the ridiculous outfits that some of these characters wear to things like Dice Dog's hair and beard, everything actually looks very theatrical. And I think that Tactics would work best as an adaptation on the stage more than any
don't threaten me with a good time.
There are so many scenes in Tactics where, sure, it would probably take a little bit of time to put together a costume for Bellius or any of the other Lucavi and stuff like that, but you can see some of these scenes so clearly in your mind's eye acted out on a stage, And I think that's probably why I really enjoy Smith and Reader's translation over the PSX translation, because it fits so much with that theatrical feeling overall. It makes it feel more, not realistic, but more like, oh, I know exactly what I'm looking at. This is a play, and this is a play I want to study for fun because I'm a dork like that.
I'm strongly agreeing with you. Not about you being a dork, but about me feeling the same way about. Yeah, I think the point I was making about the Shakespeare stuff is that like sometimes it's not as easy to access because of how it's taught to you. It's not because of how it is, because Shakespeare was. It's quite funny how he was a bit of a, he wasn't peasant, was he? But he wasn't an upper class. But this thing where it's been reinvented that he was part of the establishment because it's for us now. It's like, well, hang on a minute, like what are you on about? You know, it's
one
clever.
Of us. Oh, Bill was one of us.
It's this clever little bit of oh, actually this stuff's really well written. We can't be seen to say that some lower peasant wrote this very classist thing, which obviously ties in very well with the the theme of the story. You know, I like the language, but it is something to sit down and go, let's unpick this and where's the double meanings and the clever meanings and stuff like that. I mean, like this is a dagger I see before me. I just thought I like that one.
At some point, I'd really like to go through the two scripts side by side. I'd actually like to go through page by page and actually have a comparison.
Could go back to the first thing we did together, which was that quiz, and maybe I could like come up with a who said this line thing.
Oh God, that would kill me. I don't think I'm good enough for that one, Jack.
It's funny, the guys over at Backpage, every now and then they will do a review of a game from like a PlayStation magazine from the 90s and say, what's the game? That's quite funny. Yeah, I know. But funny enough, I did a 90s one. I got all of them. So it's just to show how much of a nerd I am. But, yeah, no, that's we could talk about this all day. But this has probably been the most, I don't know how to say it, but it's basically been the most English-y one.
No, I agree.
Story, I mean, I don't know, it's like it reminds me of like studying stories at school and stuff like this.
Like
one.
I said before, this is easily a piece of art that I think that you could very well create a thesis on, and I would, if there's anything out like that out there, please, I would love to read it.
Is it the best written Final Fantasy game?
Ooh, now that's a good question.
I think it's probably the most like they nailed the complex convoluted story with this.
I think it has the most compelling story, but I know this is something that I've said before, which Final Fantasy I consider my favorite kind of changes on a day-to-day basis anyway.
This definitely, I would say this definitely could be the best one. I'm not saying it is. I'm not
saying
it is
easily in my top three.
It is something that like, if someone says it's their favorite one, I'm not going to be like, whoa, you know, whatever. You know what I mean? It shouldn't be controversial because it is. The game design's incredible, the story's incredible, the art design's incredible, the soundtrack, it's all top-notch stuff.
There is one or two things that I would change about it, but overall, like for the most part,
it's not perfect.
This doesn't really need a lot of tweaking. It's so good. Please, if you're listening to this and you haven't played Tactics yet, do yourself a favor.
Do it. One of us. What do you think's not perfect about it then?
So for starters, I would actually like to see more downtime between the characters.
Oh, yeah.
I think especially from chapter 3 onwards, characterization takes a hit in favor of plot, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that you get stuff like, well, I thought Agrias was going to have a lot more lines. I was expecting Mustario to end up having a lot more going on.
Basically, Agrias should be in it more.
Agrias should be in it.
I think if they'd done what they wanted to, which was to have the two storylines, the parallel storylines between Delita and Ramza, it might have worked. I think it's like one of those things, like I said before, I think Final Fantasy 9 is almost a perfect game. I think the problem with that is they ran out of time with the bit where you go around the world and fight all the Guardians. You only, with two players, you only fight one of them. It would be good to be able to fight all of them as two party members, but wasn't to be, was it?
I think the only other... Oh, maybe. I think the only other thing that I can think of that I would maybe change about Tactics is the portrait sprites. Actually, I think
them show more emotion.
I would like them to show more emotion, but I'd also like them to be a bit more varied. I don't know about you, but there are so many blonde people in this game that I knew exactly what was going on in every scene. But if you like showed me a lot of portraits one after the other, I'd probably be very hard pressed to tell you the difference between Woolgraf and Algoth.
I think what we mentioned about before when I said about like, all these characters have got names, even the monsters on the map, and even the chocobos have all got names. That really adds to your, being bathing in the glory of the world, but at the same time it makes it quite confusing. Who's this? Is this person supposed to be important to the story or not? And you're like, I don't know. And it's like, who's that guy again? Like, there's a lot of that going on.
Going back to the like the theatrical look of some of the characters, again, I just want to see this on stage at this point, but it would be good to have a bit more visual variation just to distinguish things a bit better.
Would Ben Starr play Ramza or Delita?
Ben Starr, I think, would play Dice Dog. I'd like to see that.
That would be amazing.
I think he could pull it off,
That
actually.
would be absolutely amazing. What with the beard, the pointy beard?
Yeah, hell yeah.
That is an impressive pointy beard. Good. Let's revisit that again at some point because I really enjoyed that. So cool.
Please.
Let's move on to our wildcard subjects. What I find interesting about this, I said to you in the past that writing the wildcards is usually the easiest part. It was really difficult this week because it was so interesting looking at Final Fantasy Tactics. And I was like, I'm not interested in anything else other than this. But my wildcard topic, and this is because a friend of mine, a streamer called Cressup, who streams adventure games, I think I mentioned her in the past, Twitch streamer, played a game called Facade.
Ah, okay.
You're familiar with Facade, right?
I am, yes.
Cool, that's good then. I wasn't familiar with Facade until 3 or 4 days ago when I watched Cressup play through Facade. Now, Cressup does quite a lot of like adventure game stuff, and adventure games. I've learned in the last 12 months there's a lot more to adventure games than I gave credit. Obviously, I've always liked adventure games, but I didn't realize how there's this thing. If you turn around to anyone that's an adventure game fan and say adventure games are dead, then they will kill you and string you up. And it's true because they're not. It's just because they stopped being mainstream, but there's been such a thread of them throughout time. So Facade is a game from 2005, which was pinned as an artificial intelligence-based interactive story created by Michael Mateus and Andrew Stern of Procedural Arts. So what do you know about it? Have you played it?
I haven't played it myself personally. I have seen a few people over the years stream it. God, I'm trying to remember when the first time I actually learned about it was, because this was a long, long time ago that I remember reading about it.
2010 it was bigger with streaming, I think. So.
Right, okay. Either way, I know it's been on the map for a very long time, and I know that there are some very humorous responses that you can get.
There are very humorous responses. So don't know what you describe this as, but it's cult classic, might be stretching it, but it's an interesting mix of receiving accolades at the time for its technical achievement, which got the Grand Jury Prize, the 2006 Slam Dance Independent Games Festival, right? And it was also included in the book from 2010, which is the games you must play before you die, which is very interesting. 1001 games to play before you die. Though those books tend to be a bit, makes I'm still bitter that the 1001 albums before you die doesn't have the Who's Quadrophenia in it, because that's like, I can't name 1001 albums better than that. Why is it not in there? I'm disgraced. But so it's also been sort of just a meme culture. So in modern days, it's been used as a bit of an infamous streaming game. And like you said, there are some hilarious responses. So if the game itself puts the player in a role of a close friend of a couple called Grace and Trip, they've invited you over to the house for cocktails. When you get to the apartment, there is a clear tension between Grace and Trip. You can type words into the game which can either drive the couple together, drive them further apart, or getting them to kick you out of the apartment. Now, some people refer to this game as Divorce Simulator 2005. And when I learned about the stream, it was like, let's break a couple up, and I was like, what does that mean? Now, fully voice acted, and it takes place in a 3D world, using the term 3D loosely because it's not particularly good 3D. I mean, for an independent game, it's impressive, but characters have a semi 2D look, and it's that mid 2000s flash cartoon look. You've also got Comic Sans MS text in the game as well, which is a little bit lol. I mean, it's not a flash game. I don't think it's a flash game anyway. I have no idea how it was developed, but the engine itself can respond to a lot of commands. So the idea is that you type in text against the people that talk to you and they react to you. So it responds to a lot of commands, but it's almost too clever because the mood of each character can change. So that something you say to one of them on attempt 1 might be taken differently than take 2. So you can compliment a member of the couple once in playthrough 1, and they might take it really well. But the next time you do it, you might be, well, I'll do that again next time to get to the next part of the story. But they might be in a different mood, and they may think you're making a sexual advance as opposed to just complimenting them, and then start getting annoyed at you, which makes things very, very quick to jump on. So it makes it less of an enjoyable game in that sense, because it's really hard to work out the puzzle. But it kind of makes it more true to life in a sense, because it kind of reminds me of, like, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Butterfly Effect. I mean, I'm pretty familiar with the concept of the butterfly effect. A guy goes back in time and tries to change one thing, and then it has an impact later on down the line because you can't predict exactly what's going on. So you try and change the past, something gets worse. So it's kind of more of a interestingly, I've said before that I think that games are the perfect match between art and engineering. I think that this is more of an engineering, incredible, clever way of building something as opposed to actually making a fun game. I
agree. Yeah.
It goes back to the point we made, I think, in the last episode about are games art or not. I think it's artistic and engineering-y, impressive. But of course, the problem as well is that the accessibility is a little bit limiting because you need to be spot on with your spelling and grammar, which can be a little bit difficult for some people. I'd say I'm pretty good at spelling, but at the same time, you've got to be quick to type it in. So I'm really rubbish at that. And there's also one word that results in the player being kicked out immediately. Do you know what that word is?
Melons.
Yeah, you know it. You know it.
Oh, the first time I heard that, I think I laughed so hard I started crying.
Well,
Honestly.
if you say the word melon or melons, then you're kicked out because it is a slang term for a woman's breasts, which I think is hilarious, considering the fact you can say, "Would you like a threesome?" and it's fine. You can stay in that room and they just look at you like, "What?" But you say melons and that's it. That's too far, you know. So it's a good thing I don't want melons in my cocktails because that'd be sounds interesting euphemism there. So you can also get both characters to look surprised and mumble the words if you put some random comment that they don't understand. So it is hilariously funny. Actually quite well acted as well. It's not
for what it is. Yeah,
for what it is. I mean, it's not like it's not going to mind blowing performance, but like considering the fact that it looks like a silly throwaway game, it's not. It is worth playing.
Honestly, what you said about it being like a good mixture of art and engineering, and more engineering than art, I completely agree with. I remember when I first learned about it, however long ago that would have been, like it really blew my mind that this was like genuinely really interactive in a way that I hadn't seen interactivity in games to this degree before. And to know that like every single time you do a game, it changes. Like that's kind of mind-blowing even now, actually.
Yeah, totally.
I can't think of many games where you can try doing the same thing and get a completely different result, unless it's like completely RNG based, which this isn't. As far as I'm aware.
AI. I mean, the term AI is bounded around quite a lot, especially recently. But I mean, there's a game, I think it's called Dead Meat, which I may have mentioned before recently, where they're using a large language model and they're throwing their written characters into it and then it responds to you. So it's kind of the next iteration of that. So, you know, this has some pretty mainstream appeal at the time because I think in 2005, which is amazing. 2005, the New York Times called it the future of video games.
Oh, okay.
So that's like when I say mainstream appeal, not just mainstream gaming appeal. It's mainstream, you know, quite amazingly. I don't remember this from the time at all. I mean, perhaps I was just living under a rock or something, or really concerned about playing my Nintendo DS or something. But you know, something that came out nearly 20 years ago now has a similar aesthetic to Flash games from around the time. So that's probably all I'm going to say about that specific game. I would recommend going to play it. I think it's a free download still, but even if you, well, I definitely play it, but even if you can't play it, watch someone play through it because there's plenty of different things.
There are so many good like playthroughs out there, and all of them are as hilarious as the last.
It's a good romp, definitely a party. Things to put on at a party.
Careful saying the word romp. Trip might throw you out.
Yeah, maybe he will. No, it's only melons. Melon romp. Yeah, it reminds me of the old day speed runs. Well, obviously, like speed runs is a big thing. But there's like I used to watch someone speed running how to get banned on Club Penguin.
Oh God!
All we got to do is just go in and say fuck, and then we get a warning, and they say fuck again. And it's like he had the world record of like 33 seconds or something like that. yeah, things like that. That's make me laugh. I love that sort of thing. I mean, like the interactivity of like silly ways to play games. And obviously, like I'm not saying speedrunning silly, for example, but I like that the community creating their own
challenges
and silly little things and stuff like that. I mean, apparently, like in this game, there's sort of like I looked at some playthroughs and looked at some comment sections, and people are like, "Wow, I've been playing this game for 15 years and I didn't realize you could have that bit of dialogue come out."
Wow.
So it's like, wow, okay, so like it really depends. There's clearly quite a clever little tree of dialogue put in and stuff like that. It's a fun time. And what's interesting about it as well is that the music makes it really eerie. You walk in and it feels like the couple's murdered someone. It's really strange. It's really well worth playing.
I don't know if the team that originally put it together is still like together as a development team.
I don't know.
But it would be really interesting to see what they'd be able to do now, like almost 20 years after it's been released. Well, I'd like to see a Facade 2. I'd like to know if they stayed together or not.
I think there was going to be a sequel called The Party, which never came out, so I'm not sure. But it's interesting. I mean, like, it reminded me of Flash gaming days, because back in the early 2000s, Flash took over the world. I assume that these guys probably were familiar with that as well, because this is right at the end of the Flash gaming era, and I don't think it was built with Flash in any way, even though, like I say, aesthetically, it looks like a lot of those Flash games of the time. So there's another one I'm going to mention as a little bonus thing from this 2000 called The Angry Neighbors. Now you can play this yourself on Newgrounds. The Angry Neighbors. This is like hilariously badly funny, this game. It's a Flash game where you act as a mediator between a cop living next door to a woman who kills his plants through the fence.
I'm already sold.
Like, well worth playing, and they just insult each other. Like he calls her an ignorant ignoramus, and he calls her a fat cow, and it's just funny hearing them say it. I was playing this in ICT at school, and had it like through the speakers and him shouting out, "No, she would caught your fat cow," and it played out through the entire speaker system in my ICT lesson, which was my rebellious moment for like 2004 or whatever.
Oh, it's good to know that across the country, ICT labs were all being abused with Flash games.
Well worth playing. It's really funny. I mean, the guy that made this is called Michael Gibson. And Michael Gibson, like, it's one of a few games he played. There was basically, I mean, this is like one of those like old school things you probably only know from Flash games. So he made a lot of games called there's one called Interrogation, and basically there's a woman in a jail cell and you've got to interrogate her by asking her various questions. It's not as in depth. It's not AI driven. It's obviously like dialogue tree driven, like a point and click game. There's one called The Lusty Barfly, where you got to chat up a woman at a bar, and if you get things wrong, she shoots you. I remember that as well. Oh, there's loads of these games online from the same developer. He's got like 4 or 5 different games from around the time, which are really, really worth playing. And it's interesting to see that particular era of the mid 2000s, which I thought I'd throw in with Facade, because it feels like the beginning of that era. The Facade feels like the culmination of what that era developed.
Wicked. Well, that actually really ties in nicely with what I'm going to talk about. We've managed to do it again. So I think we can both agree that the internet is shit, right?
At the moment it is, yeah.
The internet used to be better.
It did.
Have you ever wanted to go back in time and go back onto the late 90s internet?
You're going to talk about the Wayback Machine?
No, I am not. What if I told you it was possible in a game called Hypnospace Outlaw?
Oh, God.
This is a simulation game that came out in 2019, so it's relatively recent. It was developed by a company called Tendershoot and published by No More Robots. I believe it was entirely funded via Kickstarter, and it was a finalist for the Independent Game Festival at 2019 for the Grand Prize finalist, the Visual Art finalist, Excellence in Audio finalist, and the Design and Nouveau honorable mentions. So I don't believe it won, but was a finalist in all of those categories. It can be a difficult game to play visually because it does take the manner of the old internet. It's a very pixelated game. It's pretty much entirely text-based. It's exactly what it says on the tin insofar as you are surfing the internet of 20 years ago, complete down to, well, the way that websites used to look. If you've ever been on an old shitty GeoCities or NeoCities website, you know exactly what I mean when I say it's all shit. Really, it looks like absolute garbage, but it's all very personalized. It's our garbage, yeah. All the pages are very personalized, and they talk about things that the person writing it wanted to talk about. Hypnospace Outlaw completely reflects this. The game is set in an alternate history of 1999, approaching the end of the year and the Y2K situation. The player is assuming the role of an enforcer. So if you've ever heard of YouTube Heroes, back when they were getting the community to try and police comments, you're doing the same kind of thing.
Right.
You are acting as essentially a moderator for this company, Merchant Soft, which is the creator of your Hypnospace headband, which allows you to surf the internet while you're asleep, because you don't have enough of the commercial internet world. You are given tasks to complete and puzzles to solve, essentially, as, I guess, a point and click kind of style game, but it's deceptive. You don't think of it as a point and click game while you're playing it, because it just feels like you're surfing the internet, really. It's not silent. There are plenty of musical tracks, and they are all considered real in universe. You have fake bands that have created fake real music. There is different times that things occur at. So I believe the game starts mid-October. After the first time skip, it's then November, and then you're approaching New Year's Eve, and then there is another time skip afterwards. So there's a lot of different time changes within the games, and the actual pages themselves reflect that. Even though you never meet another character in any of these pages, you do feel like you get to know the people of this fake internet because they have such strong personalities. The very first thing that you are told to do is to go and find images of this fish, basically. It's a copyright violation to have it on your page, so you have to take it down. The very first person that you find using this copyright violation is not happy about you taking these images off her page. Later on, she starts essentially a civil war on several pages, and it's not unlike flaming message boards that you'd see now still. Even it's not just her. There's also things like you need to stop cyberbullying amongst some teenagers. There's a hacker group that's trying to be a nuisance, and you have to try and put the kibosh on them. And all the while, your boss is being the most useless sack of shit that you can possibly imagine, and really devaluing your work as a a free moderator. So if you've ever wanted to
The good old days.
Yeah, if you've ever wanted to relive the good old days and moderate a fake Reddit page on the fake internet in an alternate world, Hypnospace Outlaw is the game for you.
Don't you just love the internet? That's really interesting.
It's also quite an accessible game as well. So I know I talked before about in Osamu Sato's works, a lot of them can be quite visually eye straining. There's a lot of flashing lights in some of his works. That's absolutely not the case with this one. It can be a bit eye strainy to do at full screen if you have a very big monitor. It looks like the kind of thing you'd expect to see on a CRT monitor. But despite the amount of font in the game, there's text to speech, which helps. You don't need to read quite as much, and you can adjust the volume and the voice. There are a few moments of like flashing and strobing effects, but they were developed specifically with a sensitivity team. So they've been created with minimal intensity and duration to help reduce the risks of seizures. It's also very colorblind friendly. So all in all, an incredibly accessible game. Can be a bit difficult in parts, but some of the puzzles have multiple answers and multiple ways to get through. There isn't one linear path to take to get there either. So you can absolutely, so to speak, sequence skip. You can jump ahead if you know what you're doing, or guess something ahead of time. Overall, really, really enjoyable. And the twist at the end of the game, you kind of see it coming, but it's still really enjoyable all the way through, start to finish.
Cool. That's intriguing.
It does look like it was developed in the 90s as well. So if you like old shitty graphics and like fake Pokemon stickers and your GeoCities
we're talking about Final Fantasy. Of course we like shitty graphics. 90s. No, actually that's something you can't say about Final Fantasy, is it? They're always a cutting edge. We've just been playing a game from 97. And that is a beautiful game. 97.
Yeah, you've just been talking about real art, Jack. Have some respect.
Yeah, that's interesting how we've gone from like the Shakespearean world of Final Fantasy Tactics to lol noob flame wars on the internet. Yeah,
a natural progression, if you ask me.
Yeah, or an unnatural progression, one of the two. Right, okay, that's it from me. So where can we find you online, Mol?
I can be found at Twitter at Dramalek.
Cool. I can be found on Twitter at JokeMolin8 and also 2 Random Words on YouTube.
Wonderful.
So, speak to you next time. See you later.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.